There is something quietly devastating about a show you used to love. Not in a dramatic way, it happens slowly, over years, in tiny increments you barely notice until one evening you find yourself half watching an episode that feels hollow in a way you cannot quite describe, and you realize you are mourning something that is technically still alive. That is what Family Guy became for a whole generation of people who were there from the beginning, or who found it in its golden window of Adult Swim reruns and scratched up DVDs. It was a show that made specific promises. It made them through the warmth of its characters, through the cleverness of its humor, through the sheer strange originality of the world it built. And then, season by season, it stopped keeping those promises, one by one. Sometimes loudly, sometimes so quietly you almost missed it. This is the story of every promise Family Guy made and what happened to each one. Pull the blankets up, get comfortable, let this wash over you, because there is something almost meditative about tracing the exact shape of something that used to matter, about laying out the full picture quietly and without anger, just as a record of what was and what became. The lights are low, your breathing is slowing down, and somewhere in the background, the Griffins are still living their frozen sitcom life in a town by the shore of Rhode Island, doing what they have always done, while the world outside their animated windows has moved on without them. Section 1. The Golden Age: What Family Guy Promised at the Very Beginning. The show that premiered on the night of the 31st of January 1999 was not the show most people think they remember. When you mention Family Guy to someone who grew up watching it, their mind jumps to the years of cutaway gags and Peter falling down and the noise he makes holding his knee, or to Stewie in a bowler hat threatening someone at gunpoint. But those memories mostly belong to the middle years, the revival seasons, the era that came after. The show that first appeared on Fox following Super Bowl 33 was quieter than that. It had a softness underneath all its irreverence. It was stranger and also more human than the version of itself it would eventually become. Seth MacFarlane was 24 years old when he pitched the show to Fox. He had come out of the Rhode Island School of Design and spent time at Hanna-Barbera working on Johnny Bravo, Cow and Chicken, and Dexter's Laboratory. Before Family Guy had a name, it had two short animated films, The Life of Larry and Larry and Steve, which MacFarlane had made as student work and then developed further. In those shorts, you could already see the bones of what was coming. There was a heavy, bumbling man and his intelligent, sarcastic dog. They talked to each other the way real friends do, with affection underneath the irritation, with patience beneath the criticism. That relationship was the seed from which everything else grew. MacFarlane took those two characters, softened some edges and sharpened others, built a family around them, and pitched a 15-minute pilot to Fox in May of 1998. Fox greenlit it. The show premiered the following January to around 22 million viewers, a number inflated by the post-Super Bowl slot but still a genuine indicator of how curious people were. The first season ran 7 episodes on Fox, and those 7 episodes established something precise and careful. They built a world. The world was Langley Falls, Virginia. No, that is American Dad. The world was a fictional town in Rhode Island, a specific kind of New England nowhere, full of specific kinds of nowhere people. There was a bar called the Drunken Clam where men drank beer and complained about their lives. There was a school called James Woods Regional High School, which suggests someone in the writer's room had thoughts about celebrity. The houses on the street looked like the kinds of houses that exist in that particular band of American suburban life, not too poor and not too comfortable, the kind of house where there is always something breaking, and the lawn is slightly too long, and someone has left a garden hose out for 3 days. Peter Griffin was not a genius, and was never meant to be. He worked at a toy factory called the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory, a name so perfectly chosen it almost feels accidental. He drank beer, he loved his friends. He was, by most measurable standards, a terrible decision-maker, but in those first 7 episodes he was also something specific and important. He was a man who knew he was not clever and still showed up for his family every single time. There is a particular flavor of masculine inadequacy in early Peter that is genuinely touching when you look back at it from the distance of 20-some years. He was not smart enough to know what he should do, but he loved his family well enough that he always tried. That combination, the incompetence and the sincerity living side by side, was the promise the show made with its lead character from the very first episode. Lois was the steady center. She was not just the wife who cleaned things up after Peter's disasters. though she sometimes was. She was a woman with her own life, her own history, her own sense of humor. She played piano. She had grown up wealthy and had chosen something smaller and more real. She found Peter genuinely funny, which was the detail that made their marriage feel like a real marriage, and not just a sitcom arrangement. You could believe that this woman had looked at this man and thought, yes, this one, and you could understand why. He was warm. He was loyal. He had the kind of unguarded enthusiasm that some people find exhausting and other people find irresistible. Brian was the dog, technically. The joke was never really that a dog could talk, because the show established immediately that Brian could talk as a simple fact of the world, the same way Peter could be fat and employed and Stewie could be evil. What made Brian extraordinary was that he was the most functional person in the house. He read books, he drank martinis, he drove a car, he had opinions about things. He was writing a novel, which meant he was failing to write a novel, which is a more human condition than actually writing one. He was Peter's best friend and he served as the show's conscience, which is a strange role for a family pet, but it worked because Family Guy always operated at that slightly sideways angle to normal reality. Brian was not the voice of reason in spite of being a dog. He was the voice of reason because he was the only one in the house who was paying enough attention to notice when things were going wrong. And then there was Stewie. Stewie Griffin was 1 year old. He wore a yellow collared shirt and a white diaper. He spoke with a refined, plummy British accent that sounded like it had been distilled from 100 years of theatrical villains. He wanted to kill his mother. He wanted to take over the world. He built laser guns in his bedroom. There has never been another character quite like early Stewie on any television show, animated or otherwise. The comedy was in the contrast, yes, this baby who was plotting mass destruction while sitting in a high chair being fed strained peas. But it went deeper than just contrast. Early Stewie was genuinely menacing. He was unpredictable. Every scene he appeared in had this low charge of threat underneath it because you genuinely did not know what he was going to do. He might say something devastating and British. He might produce a weapon from somewhere inside his diaper. He might deliver a monologue about the eventual enslavement of all humanity in the same tone a normal child would ask for more apple juice. What made him even stranger and more compelling was that most of the other characters could not understand him. To Lois, Stewie was just babbling. She would pick him up and cuddle him and tell him he was adorable, completely unaware that the infant in her arms was detailing his latest scheme for her elimination. The dramatic irony was perfect, and the show used it with great discipline in those early seasons. Every interaction between Stewie and Lois had that quiet, terrible joke underneath it. She was safe not because she was strong or clever, but because she could not comprehend the danger. The audience knew what she did not, and that gap was endlessly funny. The supporting world was drawn with the same care. Joe Swanson, introduced in the episode A Hero Sits Next Door in the first season, was the neighbor who used a wheelchair and was also the most capable man on the street. Peter was jealous of Joe in those first appearances, which is a specific kind of joke that only works if Peter is still recognizably human. You had to believe that Peter, the lovable idiot, could feel inadequate next to someone, could feel that complicated mix of admiration and envy that most people feel around people who are obviously better at the things that matter. That jealousy humanized Peter in a way that the later seasons never bothered with. Quagmire existed in those early seasons too, as a running gag about a man whose appetite for women was both absurd and somehow harmless in the show's register. He was a joke about a specific type of man rather than a portrait of one, which kept him funny rather than disturbing. Cleveland was steady and warm, the calm one, the one whose reaction to whatever Peter had just done was usually a slow, considered expression of mild exasperation. The writing in those first 3 seasons had something that is genuinely hard to articulate, but very easy to feel when you watch them back. It had a point of view. Every joke felt like it came from somewhere, from someone who had thought about it, who knew what they wanted the moment to land like. The cutaway gags were present from episode 1. They were always part of the show's grammar, but in those early seasons, they were brief and precisely placed. A character would say something, the show would dart sideways for a few seconds to illustrate the comparison with something absurd, and then it would dart right back. The story never paused for the gag. The gag decorated the story. The show ranked 33rd in the Nielsen ratings in its first season, averaging 12.8 million households. That was strong for a new animated comedy. Fox was pleased. Then they started moving it around. Thursday nights against Frasier on NBC, Tuesday nights against Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on ABC. Fox shuffled Family Guy through its schedule like a card they did not know how to play, and each move confused the audience a little more, and the ratings dropped a little further. By the end of the third season in 2002, Fox canceled the show. The announcement landed without much drama. Canceled shows rarely get dramatic announcements. They just stop. The promise of those first 3 seasons was this: here is a show that actually cares about the people inside it. Here is a dysfunctional family that is also a real family. Here is a father who will embarrass you and then apologize. Here is a dog who will be your friend through everything. Here is a baby who is quietly terrifying. Here is a world that is silly on the surface and warm underneath. That promise was real. It was earned by the writing and the performances and the specific choices that Seth MacFarlane and his original team made. It was as genuine as a promise can be in television, and it would be tested severely in the years that followed. Drop a comment down below and let me know where you are watching from and what time it is. It helps more than you know, and if you have not subscribed yet, doing that now takes about 2 seconds and means you will never miss one of these. All right, let us keep going. Section 2. The Promise of Peter Griffin, a father worth rooting for. Before anything else, before the story of what the show became, you have to spend some real time with what Peter Griffin was. He is easy to dismiss now, because the later version of him is so unpleasant that it colors everything. When you think of Peter Griffin in 2025, you probably think of a man who does cruel things to his family and then laughs about it, who causes serious harm to the people around him and faces no consequences, who seems to occupy his own show as a kind of force of chaos rather than as a character with genuine interior life. That version of Peter exists, and it is real, and we will get there. But it is not where the story starts. The Peter of seasons 1 through 3 was built on a very old and very reliable comedic template, the lovable incompetent. This template has roots going back through television history, through Ralph Cramden on The Honeymooners, through Homer Simpson in his earlier years, through a dozen working-class sitcom fathers who were the source of every problem their family faced, and also the source of all the warmth. The template works because it captures something true about a certain kind of man. A man who loves his family extravagantly and consistently fails to demonstrate that love in any practical or useful way. The gap between the love and the competence is where the comedy lives. Early Peter was specifically and carefully designed to be a man whose stupidity came from a lack of information rather than a lack of care. When he made bad decisions, it was because he genuinely did not know any better, not because he did not care about the consequences. There is a significant emotional difference between those two things, and the early writers understood it. An idiot who means well is a figure of affection. An idiot who means harm is something darker, and the show stayed on the right side of that line for its first 3 seasons with a deliberateness that only becomes visible when you see what happened later. The episode A Hero Sits Next Door from the first season is a good example of early Peter at his best. Joe Swanson moves in next door, and everyone in the neighborhood immediately loves him. Joe is confident, capable, funny, a former police officer who became disabled after an encounter with the Grinch during a robbery, which is the kind of joke that only makes sense in Family Guy's register. Peter is jealous. He tries various schemes to become the neighborhood's favorite person. He fails at all of them. Eventually, Joe helps Peter out of a dangerous situation, and Peter realizes that what he was jealous of was not Joe's capability, but the warmth people felt for Joe, and he understands that warmth can come from being genuinely good at caring about people, not just from performing care badly. That is a fairly sophisticated emotional arc for a gag-heavy animated sitcom. The joke is Peter's jealousy and the disasters it creates. But the emotional core is about a man learning the difference between respect earned through capability and love earned through generosity. That distinction was always floating underneath the comedy in those early seasons. The relationship between Peter and Lois in seasons 1 through 3 was one of the show's most quietly accomplished things. They were not the soulmates of a romantic comedy. They were two people who had chosen each other and were still choosing each other every day, imperfectly and with occasional significant frustration. Lois would get exasperated by Peter in ways that felt real rather than comedic. Peter would do something stupid that genuinely hurt Lois's feelings, and the show would pause long enough to let the hurt register before moving to the resolution. Episodes in those early seasons ended with hugs and apologies and the specific texture of a marriage that was surviving its own dysfunction through the force of genuine love. The Lois in early Family Guy was a character worth knowing. She was patient, but she had limits. She was competent, but not infallible. She had a slightly wild past that she had left behind, not because it was shameful exactly, but because she had found something she preferred. She and Peter were funny together in the way that real couples can be funny together, in the way that comes from two people who have known each other for years and have found all the specific pressure points and also all the specific pleasures. Meg in those early seasons was handled with a particular kind of thoughtfulness that the later seasons completely abandoned. She was the normal teenager in an abnormal household. She was unpopular at school in the specific way that unpopular teenagers actually are, not grotesquely, not cartoonishly, but in that quiet way where you eat lunch at the wrong table and laugh at the wrong jokes and never quite find the frequency everyone else is broadcasting on. She was not interesting to most of the other characters because teenagers often are not interesting to adults, and the show played that as a gentle and recognizable truth rather than as a target. The specific promise Peter made as a character in those first 3 seasons was this: he is the kind of dad who gets everything wrong at the level of execution, but nothing wrong at the level of intention. You could tell, watching those early seasons, that Peter Griffin loved his kids. He loved Meg even when he forgot she existed. He loved Chris even when Chris's weirdness confused him. He was frightened of Stewie in the way that dads sometimes are frightened of infants, that specific helplessness in front of a tiny creature whose needs are not entirely legible. His love for his family was not articulate or consistent or even particularly effective, but it was unmistakably real, and that made him worth watching. Then the show came back from cancellation in 2005, and the slow transformation began. It started with intelligence. Peter got dumber, significantly dumber. In those first 3 seasons, Peter's stupidity was grounded. He made bad decisions because he did not think things through, because he lacked information or perspective, because his emotional responses were quicker than his rational ones. He was not a man who could not understand basic human cause and effect. He was a man who understood it too late, after the damage was done. That is a fundamentally different kind of stupid, and it is the kind of stupid that maintains sympathy. In the revival seasons and beyond, Peter's intelligence dropped to a level that strained credibility. He began doing things that were not just unwise but incomprehensible, things that required a near-total absence of basic reasoning. By season 8 and beyond, Peter was doing things that a reasonably intelligent animal would not do, let alone a man who had held a job and raised children for more than a decade. The stupidity stopped being a character trait and became a plot device, something the writers deployed whenever they needed Peter to do something destructive without having to explain why a human being would choose to do it. But the intelligence drop was the smaller problem. The bigger problem was that Peter got meaner. In the episode from the later seasons where Peter pushes Lois underwater when he thinks he sees a shark in the water near their boat, something important is revealed. It is not funny in the way early Peter's failures were funny, because early Peter's failures came from incompetence, not from willingness to sacrifice his wife for his own survival. The Peter who pushes Lois underwater has made a choice. He has assessed the situation and decided that his own safety matters more than hers. That is not the action of a lovable idiot. That is the action of a person who does not love Lois, or at least does not love her at the moment when it counts. This distinction matters enormously. Comedy has always been able to accommodate characters who are selfish, cruel, or terrible people. That is not the issue. The issue is that the show kept presenting later Peter as though he were still early Peter, as though the warmth and love that made the early version sympathetic were still present underneath all the cruelty. They were not. The warmth had been replaced so gradually, so piece by piece, that the show never seemed to notice it was gone. Peter kept being positioned as the lovable dad even when his behavior was no longer lovable, even when the only difference between him and a straightforwardly villainous character was the show's insistence that you should find him charming. The Flanderization of Peter Griffin, a term borrowed from the Simpsons fan community to describe what happened to Ned Flanders when his one trait of religiosity expanded to consume his entire personality, was the single most damaging creative decision the show made. Peter went from a character with several traits, including warmth, incompetence, loyalty, humor, and stubbornness, to a character who was primarily defined by the combination of stupidity and cruelty. Those two traits together, with nothing to balance them, produced a character who was genuinely hard to spend time with. The episode Seahorse Seashell Party from Season 10 contains the show's own confession about what had happened to Peter. In that episode, Meg delivers a speech to her family that is essentially a list of Peter's sins. She calls him completely selfish and irresponsible. She describes his behavior with such specificity, such accurate enumeration of actual things Peter has actually done, that the speech functions as a documentation of his decline. And Peter's response to hearing this accurate accounting of his worst qualities is to laugh. He does not feel hurt. He does not feel confused. He does not even feel defensive in the specific way that people who are being criticized by someone they love will sometimes feel defensive because the criticism is landing somewhere real. He just laughs, the way you laugh at something that has nothing to do with you, the way you laugh at something that is not even a little bit serious. And in that laugh, in that specific response, the whole story of Peter's decline is contained. Early Peter would have been stung by what Meg said. He might not have fully understood it. He might have squirmed and looked at his shoes, but he would have felt it, because he was capable of feeling things that implicated him. The Peter who laughs at Meg's speech is not capable of that anymore. Something has been turned off in him, some circuit between other people's pain and his own emotional response. He has been written into a place where the consequences of his actions cannot reach him, because consequences require the ability to care about what happens to other people, and that ability has been slowly, quietly removed. The promise of Peter Griffin in 1999 was that here was a man worth watching fail, because the failing came from a real place, and the love beneath the failing was genuine. The promise was kept for 3 seasons, and then broken slowly over the next 20 plus. And because Peter is the center of the show, the center of the family, the character around whom all the others orient themselves, his decline poisoned everything around him in ways that took years to fully understand. Section 3. The promise of Brian Griffin, the everyman's best friend. There is a specific loneliness to being the smartest person in a room full of people who are not trying to be smart, and early Brian Griffin understood that loneliness in a way that made him one of the most relatable characters in the show's first run. The joke was clean and simple. Here is a dog who is also, by most measurable standards, the most functional member of a household that includes a grown man who cannot be trusted near power tools, 2 teenagers who barely register as conscious beings, a baby who is engineering weapons of mass destruction, and a woman who has heroically decided to keep all of this from becoming a public incident. Brian was the one who looked at the situation with clear eyes and said something dry and accurate about it. He was the narrator of the chaos as much as he was a participant in it, but Brian was never just a straight man. He had his own life, his own failures, his own specific and recognizable kind of dignity. He had been working on a novel for years. He had never finished it. This is one of the most honest details in the show's entire run, because the person who is working on a novel and has not finished it is a universal figure, a person with ambitions that have not yet found their execution, a person who is holding something precious and uncompleted in their mind and building an identity around the potential of that thing rather than its realization. Brian carried that novel around like a badge that had not yet been earned, and the show treated that with affection rather than contempt. He drank too much. This is the other honest detail. The drinking was not played as a gag in the early seasons, not primarily. It was played as a character trait that came from somewhere, from loneliness and from the specific sadness of being perceptive in a world that is mostly not paying attention. Brian drank in the way that certain kinds of intelligent, lonely people drink, as a way to soften the edges of a reality that keeps being sharper than you expected. The show did not moralize about it. It simply noted it as part of who he was, along with the failed novel and the feelings for Lois that he mostly kept below the surface, and the friendship with Peter that was the most sustaining relationship in his life. His relationship with Peter was the show's best friendship. It worked because of the specific asymmetry in it. Peter was not Brian's equal, and both of them knew it. But Peter was also not Brian's problem to solve. Brian had chosen to be Peter's friend, which is not the same as being obligated to be Peter's caretaker. He cared about Peter with the kind of patience that comes from genuine affection rather than from duty. He would point out when Peter was about to do something catastrophically stupid. Peter would mostly ignore him. The catastrophe would occur. Brian would help pick up the pieces. And at no point did the dynamic become hostile, because the caring was real on both sides even when the communication was failing. The early seasons also gave Brian moments of genuine vulnerability that the later seasons almost entirely abandoned. There were episodes where Brian's loneliness broke through, where his desire to be taken seriously as a writer or as a romantic partner or simply as a full and complex being was thwarted in ways that felt specific and painful. The episode Brian Wallows and Peter Swallows from the third season, which actually won an Emmy Award for Outstanding Original Music and Lyrics, is a good example. Brian gets a DUI and is sentenced to community service caring for an elderly woman named Pearl. The episode is surprisingly affecting. Brian and Pearl develop a real connection. She dies at the end. The show lets that land without immediately diffusing it with a joke. That was early Brian, capable of grief, capable of genuine connection, capable of losing something and being changed by the loss. The promise of Brian Griffin was specifically the promise of the sympathetic failure. Here was a character who wanted things and mostly did not get them, who was smarter than the situation he was in and could not escape it, who had genuine warmth and loyalty, and a set of intact values that he tried to live by. You wanted things to work out for Brian. You were rooting for the novel to get finished, for him to find someone who saw him clearly and loved what they saw, for one of his many attempts at dignity to actually succeed. That is the investment the show built with him over 3 seasons, and it was real and substantial. The betrayal of Brian Griffin in the later seasons is the most painful character arc in the entire show's history, not because of how far he fell, but because of where he started. When you fall from incompetence, the fall is expected. When you fall from integrity, from genuine goodness, from being the character the audience most identified with and most trusted, the fall changes the texture of everything around it. After the revival in 2005, Brian's political views began to take more space. This was not inherently a problem. Brian having strong opinions had always been part of who he was. The problem was in how those opinions were deployed. In the early seasons, Brian's views were expressed through dialogue that felt like a person talking, through conversations that had the rhythms of real conversation, through moments that arose organically from the situation. In the later seasons, Brian's politics became lectures. They became set pieces where the plot paused, so that Brian could address the audience directly through the medium of a character who was technically talking to another character, but functionally looking into the camera. Viewers who agreed with Brian's positions found it just as grating as those who did not, because the problem was not the content of what he was saying, but the way he was saying it. The way the show had repurposed a character who had been a friend into a platform. When a character starts to feel like a mouthpiece, they stop feeling like a person, and the audience stops feeling anything about them except the mild irritation of being talked at. But the political shift was the smaller problem, just as Peter's intelligence drop was the smaller problem. The larger problem was that Brian's fundamental decency, the bedrock quality that made him the show's moral anchor, began to erode and then to collapse. The episode Brian Writes a Bestseller from Season 9 is the turning point that many fans point to as the moment Brian became genuinely difficult to defend. Stewie encourages Brian to write something after years of the novel going nowhere. Brian writes a self-help book called Wish It, Want It, Do It, which becomes a massive bestseller. And instead of gratitude towards Stewie, who believed in him when no one else did, Brian treats Stewie with contempt. He becomes arrogant in a way that is not charming arrogance, not the arrogance of someone who has been underestimated and is finally getting their due, but the arrogance of someone who has decided that success has elevated them beyond the people who helped them get there. This is not a recognizable evolution of the Brian who had been working quietly on that novel for years. The Brian who spent seasons carrying that unfinished manuscript around would not have responded to his first real success by turning on the person who encouraged him. The transformation required a dismantling of the character's core values, and the show performed that dismantling without acknowledging it, presenting post-bestseller Brian as though he were a natural continuation of pre-bestseller Brian, rather than a different person wearing his face. The list of things Brian does in the later seasons is genuinely shocking when laid out consecutively. He gives Stewie and Chris herpes and treats it as a minor inconvenience. He destroys Stewie's beloved stuffed bear Rupert in a drunken fit. He allows a woman and her child to drown because he decides she is not worth saving once he discovers she is in a relationship. He scams Quagmire out of money after Quagmire pays for dental surgery to help Brian. He kills a baby squirrel that the children have been trying to save and faces no consequences. Each of these things, taken individually, might be explicable as a dark comedy choice. Together, they describe a character who has become not just flawed but morally compromised in ways that cannot be explained by any natural growth from his origins. The Brian of Season 1 would have been horrified by what the Brian of Season 12 was doing. The show never addressed this discontinuity, never offered a reason why this once gentle, once caring, once loyal character had become someone who let people drown because they were inconvenient to his love life. The Quagmire speech from Jerome is the New Black in Season 8 is one of the most discussed moments in the show's later run. Quagmire, who is himself not a morally uncomplicated figure, delivers a devastating assessment of Brian's behavior. He calls Brian a phony. He calls out the failed writing career and the pretentious attitude. He points out that Brian has been pursuing Peter's wife for years, right in front of Peter. He details Brian's failings with a specificity that the show had to have earned through actually depicting all the things Quagmire is describing. The speech resonates because it is accurate. What makes it emblematic of the show's larger problems is what comes after it. Nothing. The speech changes nothing. Brian continues to be exactly as Quagmire described him. The writers had enough self-awareness to put the audience's frustration into words, had enough craft to write a genuinely powerful monologue, and then had no follow-through. They used the speech as a pressure valve, a way of acknowledging the criticism without changing anything, and then went right back to the behavior that had prompted the criticism. When Brian died in Season 12 in the episode Life of Brian, hit by a car, the fan reaction was enormous. Petitions gathered over 100,000 signatures. Social media spent days in an uproar. Trending topics were dedicated to demanding his return. What was interesting about that reaction was what it revealed. People still cared about Brian. Despite everything he had done in the later seasons, despite all the ways the show had made him difficult to like, people still had an emotional connection to him that was powerful enough to generate genuine grief. That grief was for the original Brian, the one who had existed in the first run and in the early revival seasons. It was the grief of people mourning a character the show had been replacing slowly for years, a character they had never quite let go of even as the replacement became more and more unlike the original. MacFarlane, when asked about the death later, said it had done what it was designed to do. It had reminded viewers that anything could happen on the show. It had boosted the numbers. 3 weeks later, Stewie used a time machine to go back and save Brian from being hit by the car, and Brian returned as though nothing had happened. And then he kept being exactly as bad as he had been before the death, perhaps worse. The promise of Brian Griffin was a promise made with great care and kept with great skill for several seasons. It was the promise of a character who was worth knowing, worth caring about, worth rooting for. The keeping of that promise in those early years is why the breaking of it in the later seasons felt personal to so many people. You cannot lose something that was never real. The grief people felt about what happened to Brian Griffin is proof that the original character was real. Section 4. Stewie Griffin, the most original character television ever walked away from. You could make a strong argument that Stewie Griffin, in his original form, was the single most inventive character concept in the history of American animated television. This is not a small claim. The history of animated television comedy in America is long and full of remarkable inventions. Bart Simpson, Homer Simpson, Eric Cartman, Bender from Futurama, Sterling Archer, countless others. The medium has an extraordinary track record of creating characters who feel genuinely new. And still, if you hold early Stewie up against any of them, there is something that sets him apart. He occupied a space in the imagination that nothing else occupied before him, and that nothing else has occupied since. The concept sounds simple when you describe it. An infant who is secretly a criminal genius. A 1-year-old baby who speaks like a Bond villain and has a laboratory in his bedroom. A child who is, in his own estimation, the most dangerous being on the planet while existing in the complete physical and social dependency of infancy. He needed his diaper changed. He needed to be fed from a bottle. He needed to be carried from room to room by the very people he was plotting against. The gap between the scale of his ambitions and the scale of his helplessness was the engine of the whole thing, and it never ran out of fuel in those first 3 seasons because the writers kept finding new ways to play with it. The world domination plots in seasons 1 through 3 were genuinely inventive. Stewie was not just trying to kill Lois in a generic way. He had specific plans, he built specific devices, he had a philosophical framework for his villainy that was absurdist and precise in equal measure. He would deliver monologues about the future civilization he intended to build over the ashes of the current one, monologues full of specific details about architecture and governance, and the appropriate punishment of those who had failed to recognize his superiority. The sophistication of the language in those monologues, the careful deployment of vocabulary that was genuinely impressive, was itself a joke about the gap between the speaker and the audience, but it was also genuinely funny writing that worked on its own terms. The obsession with killing Lois was the show's most consistent running joke in those early seasons, and its consistency was part of what made it work. Nearly every episode had some version of the same beat, Lois doing something ordinary and maternal, and Stewie responding to it with some degree of murderous intent. The joke gained depth with repetition rather than losing it, because each new variation on the theme revealed something slightly different about the relationship. Lois's complete inability to perceive the danger was itself a characterization, a portrait of a certain kind of maternal confidence that sees only what it wants to see. The detail that Brian was one of the few characters who could genuinely understand Stewie was handled beautifully in those early seasons. Their relationship had not yet become the central pairing of the show. It was still primarily the Peter-Brian relationship that anchored things, but there were already these moments of genuine connection between the dog and the baby, moments where they recognized each other as creatures of unusual intelligence trapped in a household of comfortable mediocrity. The friendship was earned through those moments, through the specific quality of attention that they gave each other. Stewie's equipment was also a source of ongoing delight. He had a time machine, he had a mind control ray, he had a shrink ray, he had various weapons that were stored improbably in the bedroom of what looked from the outside like a completely ordinary nursery. The contrast between the exterior and the interior, the normal baby room that contained advanced weaponry, was one of the show's great ongoing visual jokes. And the equipment was always deployed in service of the character's actual goals, not just as a random source of spectacle. Stewie had purposes. He had plans. The machinery was in service of a worldview. What made the decision to walk away from that character so damaging was not just that it was a bad creative decision, though it was that the decision was made based on a misunderstanding of what made early Stewie work. The writers and MacFarlane have said in various interviews that they felt the evil baby premise had been exhausted, that they had explored every possible angle, and the joke had run its course. This explanation has always rung somewhat hollow, because the thing about a genuinely inventive character concept is that it does not exhaust itself. What exhausts is the writer's ability to find new angles, and those are not the same thing. Stewie's character was not a single joke with a limited number of iterations. It was a concept that opened out onto an infinite set of possibilities. A baby evil genius in the 21st century could have had storylines about surveillance, about digital warfare, about the specific challenges of being taken seriously in a world that refuses to see you as anything other than an infant. He could have had rivalries with other child prodigies. He could have had storylines about the nature of intelligence itself, about whether genius is a gift or a curse when it comes packaged in a body that cannot yet walk upstairs without holding the railing. Instead, the writers decided they had used up the concept and began the slow conversion of Stewie from villain to companion. The evil genius baby became, over the course of seasons 4 through 8, a sensitive and emotionally complex child who had adventures with his dog. The world domination plots became rarer and then almost absent. The attempts on Lois's life faded to a few token references per season, and then to almost nothing. The weapons in the laboratory appeared occasionally, as nostalgia for a version of the character the show had retired. The Stewie that replaced the original was not a bad character. He and Brian had genuine chemistry, and some of the Road 2 episodes that featured the two of them on adventures together were among the show's best moments in its later run. The friendship between them produced real warmth in some of the show's most emotionally resonant moments. The Christmas Guy episode from Season 12, where Stewie uses a time machine to go back and save Brian from being hit by the car, is genuinely touching. The grief that drives Stewie's decision in that episode is real, and the episode's resolution earns its emotional weight. But here is the problem. There are many animated characters who are emotionally vulnerable and have meaningful friendships with odd companions. That is a rich and well-populated category of characterization. There was exactly one evil genius baby who built laser guns in his crib and plotted the subjugation of all humanity between episodes of Sesame Street. Exactly one. And the show had him, and it chose to replace him with a character that fit a more familiar template, one that was easier to write for and easier to sustain across many seasons. The writers justified this as character development. Stewie grew, he changed, he became more fully human, more emotionally available, more complex in the ways that matter to people who write about character arcs. But there is a meaningful difference between a character growing and a character being replaced. Growth involves continuity, involves the new state emerging recognizably from the old one. What happened to Stewie was closer to replacement. The new Stewie was not the old Stewie having grown. He was a different conception of who Stewie was, dropped into the same body and the same yellow shirt, with occasional callbacks to the original version that felt more like eulogies than continuations. The Season 6 two-parter Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie was the show's farewell to the original character, whether or not it was consciously intended as such. In those episodes, Stewie finally achieves what he has been working towards since the pilot. He kills Lois. He takes over the world. He becomes the dictator he always wanted to be. The episodes are thrilling and darkly funny, and dramatically satisfying in a way that almost nothing else in the show's post-revival run achieved. And then the twist. The whole thing was a simulation run on Stewie's computer. It did not happen. Everything reset. The use of the simulation twist was clever, but it also revealed something about the show's fundamental unwillingness to commit to consequences. It could imagine the completion of Stewie's arc. It could write it beautifully, but it could not let it stand. The show blinked at the last moment and pulled everything back to safety. And after those episodes, the evil Stewie appeared with decreasing frequency in decreasing seriousness until he was mostly gone. The current Stewie, the one who has been running for the show's last 15-plus seasons, is a perfectly serviceable character who is occasionally very funny. But the original Stewie was not a perfectly serviceable character. He was an irreplaceable one. And the distance between those two things is the exact measure of what the show lost when it decided it had run out of ideas for him. Section 5. Meg Griffin and the Promise That Was Never Fulfilled. Meg Griffin was built to be a specific kind of joke, and it was a joke with heart in it. The joke was about the ordinary person in an extraordinary family. Everyone else in the Griffin household had a defining quality that set them apart from the world. Peter was spectacularly incompetent and yet managed to function. Lois was the capable woman holding everything together with improbable patience. Brian was the talking, martini-drinking, novel-writing dog. Stewie was the infant engineering mass destruction. Chris had an odd, clueless energy that made him funny in small doses. And Meg was just a normal teenage girl. She wanted to be popular and was not. She wanted to be noticed, and was not. She wanted to be loved, and she was, technically, but in that distracted, partial way that teenagers in chaotic families often are, not quite seen clearly, not quite heard completely. In the first 3 seasons, Meg's normalcy was the joke, and it was a gentle joke because normalcy is not something you punish a person for. The comedy of her situation came from the contrast. The least interesting person in an interesting household, perpetually at the margins of her own family's story, always slightly out of frame. There was something recognizable about Meg in those early seasons, something that teenagers who had ever felt invisible in their own homes might have seen in themselves. That recognition was real, and the show wore it lightly. Mila Kunis took over the role of voicing Meg from Lacey Chabert starting in Season 2, and she brought the character a particular quality of resigned determination, the sound of a teenager who has decided to keep trying, despite consistent evidence that trying is not working. Kunis made Meg sound like a real person in a way that is not always true of animated characters. There was effort in the voice, effort that the character herself was making to engage with a world that mostly did not want her engagement. Meg had real storylines in those early seasons. She had crushes. She had friendships, fragile ones, but real. She navigated high school in the specific and difficult way of someone who is not quite at the bottom, but is also nowhere near the top, that vast, uncomfortable middle where most teenagers actually live. Her family did not despise her. Her father said insensitive things sometimes, the way fathers who are not quite paying attention will say insensitive things. and Meg would react with the specific hurt of a daughter who has noticed the inattention. But the inattention was not cruelty. It was just the ordinary failure to be fully present that most parents commit most of the time. The transformation of how the show treated Meg began around season 4. The jokes about her changed register. They shifted from jokes about her being boring or overlooked to jokes about her being ugly, physically undesirable, fundamentally unwanted. This is a more vicious kind of comedy, and the shift represents a genuine choice about what kind of show Family Guy wanted to be. There is a meaningful distinction between comedy that comes from a character's choices or situation and comedy that comes from a character's physical existence. Meg's early unpopularity was at least theoretically something she could have changed, or that circumstances could have changed. Popularity is contingent, shifting, dependent on 100 social factors that can align differently on any given day. The jokes about Meg being ugly, being physically repulsive, being someone whose appearance caused others to gag, placed the comedy in territory that had no exit. You cannot leave a body. You cannot improve your way out of a face. The joke about Meg being undesirable because of her appearance was a joke with no redemption arc built into it, a joke that could only be repeated and escalated, never resolved. What started as escalated mockery became something else by the middle seasons of the show's run. The other characters stopped merely making jokes about Meg and began actively harming her. Peter stopped being an inattentive father and became a hostile one. He would fart in her face as entertainment. He would make comments about wishing she did not exist. He would physically push her out of his way. In one episode, a flashback reveals that Peter and Lois attempted to abandon Meg at a fire station when she was an infant. This is presented as a joke. The audience is meant to laugh at it. The humor is supposed to come from the extremity of the rejection, the idea that two parents wanted to dispose of their baby daughter. There is no version of that joke that works if the earlier version of the Griffins is still in your mind. The Peter who tried to abandon his infant daughter is not the same Peter who spent the first 3 seasons demonstrating, imperfectly but genuinely, that he loved his kids. The two versions of the character cannot coexist, and the show never acknowledged the discontinuity, simply placing them both in the same history as though they were compatible. The treatment of Meg in the show's middle seasons is notable enough that it became a source of real-world conversation. Mila Kunis has spoken publicly about how fans would approach her and direct Peter's dismissive catchphrase at her, the line that became synonymous with Meg's abasement. The fictional cruelty had found its way into the real world. People had absorbed the show's treatment of Meg deeply enough that it had become a cultural behavior, a way of communicating dismissal that borrowed its shorthand from a cartoon character's humiliation. The episode Seahorse Seashell Party from the 10th season is the show's most revealing moment regarding how it understood what it had been doing to Meg. The setup is meaningful. Trapped indoors during a hurricane, with no television to distract them, the Griffin family reverts to their usual dynamic of targeting Meg with abuse. Meg, finally and for the first time in years, stands up. She turns on each member of her family with specificity and accuracy. She details what Peter has done to her. She addresses what Lois has allowed. She speaks to Chris about his participation. She is not hysterical. She is not begging. She is simply stating facts that the show has been depicting for years, doing the accounting that the show itself had never done. For a few minutes, Seahorse Seashell Party is one of the best episodes in the show's entire post-revival run. Meg's speech is well-written and delivered with real emotion by Kunis. It feels like a genuine reckoning, like the show finally looking directly at what it had been doing and deciding to address it honestly. And then Meg apologizes and takes everything back. The reasoning the episode offers is that without Meg absorbing the family's abuse, the other family members will turn on each other and the household will collapse. Meg is the lightning rod, the designated target, and she chooses to resume that role to keep the family functional. The episode frames this as a sacrifice, as Meg being selfless, as her choosing her family over her own dignity. The critics and fans who were appalled by this ending were right to be appalled, not because the ending was poorly executed, but because of what it was communicating. The episode's resolution told anyone who was watching and taking it seriously that abuse victims are responsible for managing the dysfunction of their abusers, that choosing to leave a harmful situation is selfish, that the correct response to being treated badly is to continue being available for treatment. This is not a message that the show intended to send, almost certainly. But it is the message the episode delivers, And the distance between intention and impact is itself revealing about how little thought had been put into the Meg situation over the years. The show had made Meg a punching bag without thinking about what that meant, and when it finally tried to think about it, it still could not find its way to a resolution that did not reinforce the very dynamic it was attempting to critique. There were individual episodes scattered through the later seasons where Meg was treated as a genuine character rather than a target. Her friendship with Lisa Simpson in the Simpsons crossover episode from season 13 was warmly written and gave both characters something meaningful to do. The episode that explored the origins of Peter's hostility toward Meg, tracing it back to his own experience of being abused by a sister growing up, was one of the show's more emotionally sophisticated efforts in its later run, and it produced a genuinely moving reconciliation between Peter and Meg. And then the next episode reset everything. Meg went back to being the target. Peter went back to being hostile. The moment of understanding and repair might as well not have happened, because the show had no interest in the consequences of that moment, had no interest in the changes that a genuine reconciliation would have required. The promise of Meg Griffin was the promise of the ordinary teenager, the promise that the least spectacular person in the room was still a full person with a full interior life and a right to be seen clearly. The early seasons kept that promise imperfectly but genuinely. The later seasons broke it systematically, over hundreds of episodes, in ways that became genuinely troubling to watch when taken in aggregate. By around season 14 and 15, the extreme abuse did begin to diminish. Credit for that has been given partly to the addition of more women to the writing staff, who apparently pushed back against what the show had been doing to Meg with increasing insistence. She started getting episodes where she was competent, where she stood up for herself and the standing up stuck, where she was funny and interesting on her own terms rather than just available to be hurt. The character started to recover something, but the damage of those middle seasons was real and cumulative. Roughly a decade of television had defined Meg Griffin primarily through her suffering. What that decade produced was not comedy about an ordinary girl. It was comedy about a girl who deserved to be abused, and there is no way to characterize that as keeping any promise that the original show made. Section 6. The cutaway from secret weapon to crutch. Every television show has a signature technique, something it does that immediately identifies it as itself rather than something else. The cutaway gag was Family Guy's signature technique from the very first episode, and for several seasons it functioned as one of the most effective comedy tools in primetime television. Understanding what happened to that tool is understanding a large part of what happened to the show. The mechanics are simple. A character says something that triggers a comparison. This is worse than the time I. This reminds me of when, at that point, the screen cuts away from the main story to a brief, usually self-contained comic scene that illustrates the comparison or explores an adjacent absurdity. The scene plays out, often only a few seconds, sometimes longer, and then the show cuts back to the main storyline, which picks up where it left off. In the first season of Family Guy, this technique was used with the precision of a good jazz musician adding a run to a melody. The melody was already there, the main story, and the run was the cutaway, an embellishment that added color and unexpectedness without ever swallowing the structure beneath it. The cutaways were brief. They were tightly written. They were selected with an eye toward what would be surprising in that specific moment, rather than toward what could be dropped in anywhere. They did not interrupt the story. They decorated it. The early cutaways also worked because they came from a place of genuine creativity. The best of them had the quality of a joke told by someone who had really thought about what would be funniest at that exact moment, rather than what would be funniest in general. They were precise. A joke about a specific kind of historical anachronism would be different from a joke about a specific type of celebrity or a specific pop culture reference. The variety was real variety, not just the illusion of variety that comes from cycling through a fixed set of categories. The revival changed the use of the cutaway, and it changed it in the way that most creative tools change when they become more valued than the thing they are supposed to serve. The cutaways got longer. They got more frequent. The plots of individual episodes got thinner because the cutaways were filling the runtime that stories would otherwise have occupied. By the middle seasons, a typical Family Guy episode could be thought of as a delivery mechanism for a series of disconnected gags rather than as a story that used gags as ornament. The structural problem this created was significant. A story needs time to breathe. Characters need to interact in ways that reveal who they are, that develop the relationships between them, that create situations complex enough to be interesting. When the story is compressed to accommodate the volume of cutaways, none of this can happen properly. Episodes began to feel like things were happening, but without the connective tissue that would make the things feel consequential. Peter would do something. There would be a cutaway. Another cutaway. The story would advance by a small increment. Several more cutaways. An ending that resolved the setup with a minimum of elaboration. The South Park creators Trey Parker and Matt Stone made this critique directly in their Season 10 two-part episode Cartoon Wars, which aired in 2006. In those episodes, they depicted Family Guy's creative process as involving manatees pushing random balls containing ideas into combinations, producing gags with no internal logic and no connection to anything. The argument was that Family Guy's cutaways could be replaced by any other cutaways without changing the show, because the gags were not selected for their relationship to the story or the characters. They were selected for their potential to get a laugh in isolation, which is a different and weaker standard. McFarlane pushed back on this characterization, and there was some fairness in the pushback because the early seasons did not fully match the description. But as the seasons progressed, Parker and Stone's critique became increasingly accurate. The later cutaways did have a quality of interchangeability, a sense that the specific gag in the specific episode could have been swapped for a different specific gag in a different specific episode without anything fundamental changing. They were funny in the way that a random joke can be funny, the way that anything with a reasonable setup and a reasonable punchline can get a response, but they were not funny in the way that early Family Guy cutaways were funny, which was the way things are funny when they feel exactly right for the moment. The Conway Twitty bit is the most famous example of the cutaway, taken to its logical and most absurd extreme. Conway Twitty was a country singer who enjoyed considerable success in the 1970s and 1980s. Family Guy started inserting full, unedited performances of Conway Twitty songs into episodes as cutaways. Not brief references, not 30-second clips, extended performances, lasting long enough that the audience would begin to understand that the joke was not the song but the act of making them sit through the song. The gag was the show's own refusal to provide comedy. The comedy, if it existed at all, was in the audacity of the non-joke. The first time this happened, it had the quality of something unexpected and therefore, for some viewers, genuinely funny. By the third or fourth iteration, it had become a symbol of everything the critics hated about the later seasons. It was the show saying, out loud, that it did not have enough material to fill the episode and was going to occupy the time with a country music performance instead. It was the writers daring the audience to keep watching, even as they declined to provide a reason to do so. It was a declaration that the show had stopped caring about the exchange between itself and its viewers. The exchange that says, we are making something and you are watching it, and there is value moving in both directions. The counter-argument is that the Conway Twitty bit was itself a meta-commentary, a joke about the arbitrary nature of the cutaway format, a winking acknowledgement that the show knew what it was doing and was choosing to do it anyway. There is something to this reading, but meta-commentary about artistic laziness is still artistic laziness. Acknowledging that your joke is not working while continuing to tell it does not make the joke work. It just adds a layer of knowingness that does not change the underlying situation. The show was aware that its cutaway dependency had become a conversation, and it addressed this awareness in some episodes in ways that were clever but ultimately unsatisfying. In Back to the Pilot from Season 10, Brian and Stewie travel back in time to the first episode and observe the original characters waiting in awkward silence while a cutaway runs. The gag is that the characters have nothing to do during their own show's signature technique. This is genuinely funny and also perfectly accurate. But the episode, having made the point, returned to using cutaways in the same way in the same quantities in every subsequent episode. The self-awareness was decorative rather than corrective. What the cutaway problem revealed, at its core, was something about the relationship between a show and the stories it tells. A show that produces genuinely great individual moments without a story context is not a worse show than one that produces both. But Family Guy was not originally designed to be a show about moments. It was designed to be a show about a family, about the ongoing story of specific people in a specific situation. The cutaways were always meant to be commentary on that story, observations made from a sideways angle about the world the Griffins inhabited. When the story thinned out to the point of near transparency, the cutaways lost their anchor. They were floating in narrative space, with nothing beneath them to give them weight. The show Brian and Stewie from Season 8 is the counterexample that proves the point. In that episode, Brian and Stewie are accidentally locked in a bank vault for an evening. There are no cutaways, there is no external story. It is just two characters in a single location talking to each other honestly for 22 minutes. Brian reveals he keeps a gun in a safety deposit box because there are times when he has thought about ending his own life. Stewie reveals the depth of his love for Brian. The episode is raw and uncomfortable and real in a way that almost nothing else in the show's post-revival run managed to be. It works precisely because there is no escape from the characters, no ability to cut away to something lighter when the conversation gets too heavy. That episode demonstrated something important. Family Guy did not need the cutaway to be great. It needed good writing and well-developed characters. The show had both of those things in its early years, and they were enough. The cutaway was a bonus, a way to add variety and surprise to an episode that was already working. When the good writing and the well-developed characters were depleted, the cutaway could not compensate. It could only fill time. Section 7. The Promise of Heart, when the Griffins actually loved each other. There is a scene from the first season of Family Guy, from the episode Death Has a Shadow, where Peter has been caught committing welfare fraud on a massive scale, and the judge is about to sentence him when Stewie suddenly produces his mind control device and compels the judge to let Peter go free. The family reacts with relief and confusion, and the episode ends, as most early episodes ended, with the family intact and the crisis averted, and the specific warmth of people who are frustrating each other but are also choosing each other. That specific warmth was the thing. It was not sentimentality. Exactly, because early Family Guy was too sarcastic and too aware of its own absurdity for conventional sentimentality. It was something more pragmatic than sentiment, more earned than sweetness. It was the sense that underneath all the chaos, all the bad decisions and the failed plans and the constant minor disasters of Griffin family life, there was something real holding these people together. Something that made the chaos survivable because the people generating it genuinely cared about each other's survival. The warmth in early Family Guy was quiet. It came not through big speeches or dramatic declarations, but through small moments. The way Peter would reach for Lois's hand after they had been fighting, the way Brian would stay up with Stewie when Stewie could not sleep, the way Chris would get quietly proud when something went well for one of his parents, even if he did not understand quite what had happened. These moments were not foregrounded. The show did not pause to underline them or direct the audience's attention to them with swelling music. They were just there, woven into the fabric of episodes that were primarily comedies, the evidence of an emotional intelligence that the show's creators brought to the characters without advertising it. The best example of this emotional intelligence is the relationship between Peter and Lois. Not the plot of their relationship, not the events that happened to them, but the texture of the relationship itself, the way they moved around each other. Lois laughed at Peter's jokes in those early seasons, genuinely. The way you laugh at a joke that you have heard the shape of before, but that still surprises you in the execution. Peter talked about Lois to his friends with a pride that was almost boyish, the pride of a man who cannot quite believe he ended up with the person he ended up with. They fought with the specific rhythms of a marriage, with the history and shorthand, and the ability to wound each other precisely because of how well they knew each other. In the episode Stuck Together, Torn Apart from the third season, Peter and Lois's marriage faces a genuine challenge when their therapist advises a trial separation. The episode takes the premise seriously enough to let it breathe, to let Peter and Lois both feel the specific disorientation of suddenly not having the person you have built your life around. It is funny, because Family Guy is always funny, but the emotion underneath the comedy is real. The episode earned its ending, the reconciliation and the understanding that their relationship was worth the work it required. That kind of emotional earning disappeared gradually after the revival. The Griffins stopped feeling like a real family and started feeling like characters occupying the same space. The warmth was replaced first by tolerance, and then by something colder, a cohabitation without genuine care, a collection of people who were related to each other but did not particularly like each other or wish each other well. Peter's treatment of Lois in the later seasons was a long way from the man who had seemed slightly amazed by his good fortune in marrying her. Lois's treatment of her children became intermittently cruel in ways that the early show would not have permitted. The family that the first 3 seasons had built, a dysfunctional but genuinely loving unit, had become something else. The specific mechanism of this change was the show's abandonment of consequences. In the early seasons, when Peter did something that hurt Lois, Lois was hurt, and the episode acknowledged that hurt and worked toward its resolution. The resolution was not always perfect or fully satisfying, but it was genuine. Something had happened. The something had affected someone, and the show honored that affectedness by giving it time and weight. In the later seasons, consequences became optional. Peter could do something severely harmful, and the episode would end without the harm ever being addressed. The next episode would begin with everything reset, the harm as absent from the world as though it had never occurred. This is not just a storytelling laziness, though it is that. It is a fundamental change in what the show believed about its characters. A show that honors consequences is a show that believes its characters are real enough to be affected by what happens to them. A show that abandons consequences is a show that has stopped believing in its characters' reality. The loss of warmth was connected to the escalation of cruelty, and both were connected to the growth of the cutaway. When your show is spending large portions of its runtime on disconnected gags that have nothing to do with the characters or their relationships, you have less time to build the quiet moments of connection that produce warmth. The warmth in early Family Guy was built in the spaces between the jokes, in the transitions, in the moments of genuine reaction. When those spaces were filled with cutaways, the warmth had nowhere to grow. There were flashes of the old emotional intelligence in the later seasons, episodes that remembered what the show was capable of when it was working. The Brian and Stewie episode from Season 8, certain of the Road 2 specials. The Simpsons crossover episode from Season 13, which treated both families with enough respect to produce some genuinely sweet interactions between characters from 2 long-running animated shows that rarely allow themselves to be sweet. Individual moments within otherwise mediocre episodes that briefly recalled what the show had been. These moments proved that the capacity had not been entirely lost. The writers who produced those moments were working from the same genetic material as the writers who had built the show's early warmth, and they could access that material when they chose to. The problem was that the show's structure had evolved in ways that made those moments hard to produce consistently. A show that runs on cutaways and shock value and the deliberate avoidance of consequence does not have much room for the quiet, patient work of emotional truth. The promise of heart, of a real family underneath the chaos, was the most fundamental promise the original Family Guy made. Without it, the comedy was just noise. With it, even the least successful gags had something to land against, something warm to bounce off of. The show's early brilliance was inseparable from the genuine affection it had for its characters. And the show's later decline was inseparable from the loss of that affection. Section 8. The Resurrection Promise. What the revival was supposed to deliver. The story of Family Guy's cancellation and return is one of the most unusual stories in American television history, and it matters for understanding what went wrong because the expectations the revival created were enormous, and the way those expectations were managed reveals something essential about how the show understood its own obligations. When Fox canceled Family Guy in 2002, the cancellation was a business decision rather than a quality judgment. The show had been shuffled between time slots with a frequency and an arbitrariness that made it genuinely difficult for audiences to find it. On Thursday nights, it faced Frasier, which was then at the peak of its final seasons and drawing enormous audiences on NBC. On Tuesday nights, it faced Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, which in those years was a ratings phenomenon that dominated the time slot it occupied. Fox moved Family Guy around like a piece in a game where the objective was never entirely clear, and the audience, unable to find the show consistently, drifted away in numbers that the network read as disinterest. The show's revival was produced by the specific intersection of 2 business forces that had never previously combined to rescue a canceled television program. The first was Adult Swim's decision to purchase the rerun rights to Family Guy's first 3 seasons. Cartoon Network acquired those rights cheaply because Fox had no reason to value a canceled show's catalog and began airing them in 2003. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Family Guy became the most watched program on the Adult Swim block, averaging around 1.9 million viewers for reruns of episodes that had already aired. It boosted Adult Swim's overall viewership by 239%. The second business force was DVD. The complete first season of Family Guy was released on DVD in 2003 and went on to sell more than 2.2 million copies, making it the second best-selling TV series DVD release of that year, behind only the first season of Chappelle's Show. These were not passive consumers waiting for something to watch. These were active fans who were seeking the show out, paying for it, showing it to other people, building a constituency that had not existed during the show's original run. Fox, presented with this evidence, made what must have seemed like an obvious decision. They ordered new episodes. Season 4 premiered on the 1st of May, 2005, to nearly 12 million viewers. The return was the story of that television season in a way that very few returns had ever been. A show had come back from the dead. Not once, but twice, since there had been a brief partial revival attempt that had not taken hold. Family Guy had now survived 2 cancellations through the power of its audience's loyalty, and that loyalty was being honored with new episodes after a 3-year absence. The promise implicit in that return was substantial. The audience had done something unusual and rather beautiful, had spent their own money on DVDs, and had spent their evenings watching reruns and had signed petitions, and had done all the things that fan communities do to demonstrate that something matters to them. And the show came back, which should have meant, "We know what you love about this. We know why you bought those DVDs. We know which episodes you have watched more than once and which characters mean the most to you. We are going to give you more of that." The promise of the revival was the promise of continuity, of a show that understood what it had been and was committed to remaining that thing. The audience had not been loyal to an abstract version of Family Guy. They had been loyal to the specific show that had existed in those first 3 seasons. The show with warm characters and clever writing and a family underneath the chaos. That was what they had bought on DVD. That was what had been playing on Adult Swim at 1 in the morning to audiences of nearly 2 million people. Wake up. That was the object of the loyalty. What the revival delivered was something different. The season 4 episodes were good, mostly. Some of them were excellent. But even in season 4, the signs of change were present. And they were changes in the direction away from what the audience had loved rather than toward it. The cutaways lengthened. Peter started getting dumber in ways that were less grounded than before. The warmth became intermittent rather than consistent. The writing room had been restaffed with people who had different sensibilities from the original team, and those different sensibilities were already making themselves felt. MacFarlane has been candid in interviews about the effect of the cancellations on the writing staff. Every time the show was canceled, he had noted, the writers dispersed to other projects. They had to. You cannot ask someone to sit and wait for 3 years for a show that may never come back. When the revival happened and production began again, new writers had to be hired. People who had watched Family Guy but had not made it, who admired it from the outside without having been part of building it from the inside. The institutional memory, the understanding of why specific choices had been made and what specific effects they had been trying to produce, was fractured. This is not a criticism of the new writers. They were talented professionals doing their jobs. But there is something irreplaceable about the knowledge that accumulates in a writing room that has been building a show together from the beginning. Knowledge about the characters that is not written in any document, that lives in the conversations and disagreements and small decisions that happen over months of working together. When that knowledge is lost, the show continues, but something in its foundations has shifted, and the shift is not immediately visible and not easy to correct. The revival promise was broken not in any single episode, but in the aggregate. If you watch seasons 1 through 3 and then watch season 4, you will find a show that is still recognizably Family Guy. The characters are in the right places. The relationships have the right shapes. The comedy has the right rhythms. But something has changed in the temperature of the thing, in the quality of the light. The show is a few degrees colder. The characters are a little less present to each other. The warmth has not gone, but it is no longer the default setting. It has become one option among several, rather than the baseline from which everything else operates. By the time you reach season 8, the show that had been promised by the revival had been almost entirely replaced by something else. The revival had delivered audience numbers and advertising revenue and renewed merchandise deals and everything that the networks and the studios and the business side of television cares about. But it had not delivered the continuation of what the loyal fans had actually been loyal to. It had delivered the brand without the thing that made the brand worth anything. The audience responded the way audiences always eventually respond when the thing they were promised is not delivered. They left, not all at once, not in any single dramatic event. They left gradually, in the way that people leave things that used to matter to them and now just feel familiar without feeling meaningful, in the way that you might still occasionally watch a show out of habit after you have stopped caring what happens in it. Section 9. Seth MacFarlane and the Promise of a Creator Who Cared. There is a theory about television shows that goes like this. A show is only as good as the person who cares most about it, and a show can survive a lot of different problems as long as the person who cares most is still actively involved. This theory has support from the evidence. The Simpsons in its great years was guided by a succession of showrunners who each brought genuine vision and investment to the work. When that investment became more diffuse, spread across more people with less personal stake in the show's specific identity, the quality followed a recognizable pattern. The same is true of shows in every genre. The presence of a person who cares deeply and specifically about the thing being made is not sufficient for greatness, but its absence is almost always consequential. For Family Guy, that person was Seth MacFarlane. This is not a hagiography of MacFarlane, who has his own well-documented limitations and who made choices about the show that contributed to its decline even during the years when he was most involved. But in those early seasons, his presence and his investment were palpable in the work. The show had a specific point of view that was identifiably his, specific sensibilities about comedy and character and the relationship between the two that expressed themselves throughout the texture of the episodes in ways that made the show feel like it had an author. Not just a production, not just a brand, but an author. MacFarlane voiced Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire. This is not a casual commitment. Voicing 4 major characters in a show requires thousands of hours of recording over the course of a season, hours spent in the booth doing takes and variations and emotional adjustments, hours that provide an intimate, ongoing relationship with the characters. When you spend that much time inhabiting a character, you develop an understanding of them that is different from what you can get from reading their lines on a page. You know what they sound like when they are afraid, when they are trying to appear confident, when they are genuinely happy versus when they are performing happiness. That knowledge seeps into the character's portrayal in ways that even the actor might not be fully conscious of. Beyond the voicing, MacFarlane in those early years was involved in the writing, the animation decisions, the overall shape of the show's comedic vision. He was the person who could look at a script and know whether a joke was working before it was recorded, because he understood at an instinctive level what the show's specific register was and whether any given line was operating within that register or outside it. That calibration is one of the most valuable things any creative leader can provide, and it is the hardest thing to transfer to other people because it is not a rule or a principle that can be articulated. It is a feel developed through years of work on the specific project. Around 2011, MacFarlane reduced his direct involvement in the show's creative process substantially. The showrunning duties moved to Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin, who were experienced professionals with deep familiarity with the show's world. MacFarlane continued to voice his characters and to hold an executive producer credit. But the day-to-day decisions, the episode-to-episode judgments about what was and was not working, the calibration of the show's comedy against its own established standards, all of that was now being made without the person who had developed the most finely tuned sense of what the show should be. MacFarlane's reasons for stepping back were not mysterious. He had become one of the most sought-after people in Hollywood. In 2012, he directed and starred in Ted, a live-action comedy about a man and his living teddy bear that earned over $500 million worldwide. In 2014, he made A Million Ways to Die in the West. In 2017, he created and starred in The Orville, a science fiction comedy drama for Fox that drew comparisons to early Star Trek and developed its own passionate following. He produced the Cosmos reboot for Fox and National Geographic. He released several albums of jazz and big band standards. He was, by any measure, one of the most productive people in the entertainment industry during this period, and Family Guy was one item on a very long list. None of this is a criticism. MacFarlane was building a career and a body of work that extended far beyond the show he had created in his mid-20s, and there was no reason he should have confined himself to that one project indefinitely. The problem was not that he pursued other things. The problem was that what he left behind when he stepped back from active involvement was the most important quality the show had possessed. The sense of authorship, the sense that someone was steering the thing with genuine personal investment in where it went. Appel and Sulkin and the writers who worked under them were not making bad choices out of laziness or indifference. They were talented professionals managing an enormously complex production, but they were inheriting a show rather than creating one, and there is a fundamental difference in how those two activities feel from the inside. When you inherit a show, you are always working in relation to what already existed, always asking whether a given choice is consistent with the established character or story or tone. When you create a show, you are the authority on those questions because you are the origin of the answers. The uncertainty that comes with inheritance is not a personal failing, it is structural. MacFarlane's relationship with Fox during this period added another dimension to the situation. He has been publicly critical of the network on numerous occasions, particularly in regard to Fox News, which shares ownership history with Fox Broadcasting, the network that airs Family Guy. In 2021, he posted on social media that Tucker Carlson's commentary made him wish his show was on any other network, comparing his relationship with Fox to a failing marriage. This was not a private frustration vented to a friend. It was a public declaration of alienation from the platform that hosted his creation, made by the creator himself. In 2020, MacFarlane signed a massive deal with NBC Universal, reportedly worth around $200 million over 5 years. This moved his production company into an entirely different corporate ecosystem. His newer projects, The Orville on Hulu and the Ted prequel series on Peacock, were being made for companies that had nothing to do with Fox. He was building his future in a direction away from the network that Family Guy was still airing on. The result was an unusual situation. A show whose creator had publicly expressed his desire to be on a different network, was contractually obligated to continue voicing its characters, had handed the creative direction to others, and had signed a major deal with a different company for his future work. Family Guy was continuing to be made not because anyone was burning with creative passion to make it, but because the business arrangements that kept it in production had not been severed. MacFarlane's own words from an interview in 2024 are revealing about how he had come to think about the show. He said he did not see a good reason to stop because people still loved it, and it made people happy, and it funded causes he cared about. He framed the show's continued existence as a matter of financial utility, a source of funds for good causes rather than a source of creative expression. He used the phrase escape velocity to describe the show's current state, arguing that after so many seasons, there was no logical reason to end it unless the audience stopped caring. He was talking about the show the way you talk about a revenue stream, with the pragmatism of someone who has moved on creatively but retained the intellectual property. The promise that MacFarlane made by creating Family Guy, by pouring the specific intelligence and passion and vision into those early seasons, was the promise that the show would be made by someone who cared whether it was good or not. That promise could not be kept indefinitely. No creator can remain that invested in a single project across decades while building the breadth of career that MacFarlane was building. But the distance between the MacFarlane, who pitched a 15-minute pilot to Fox in 1998 with his whole career ahead of him and his whole investment behind him, and the MacFarlane of 2024, discussing the show in terms of its utility to environmental causes, is the distance that the show had to fall. Section 10. The humor promise sharp, clever, timeless comedy. The most fundamental promise any comedy makes is that it will be funny. Family Guy made that promise and then made a more specific version of it. It will be funny in a way that is clever, that rewards attention. That works because someone thought carefully about what would be funniest rather than what would be most immediately stimulating. The early seasons of Family Guy demonstrated something that was, at the time, not obvious about animated comedy. That you could be edgy and subversive and willing to go to uncomfortable places without sacrificing the quality of the underlying writing. The show was provocative, certainly. It made jokes about race and religion and politics and death and sex that other animated comedies of the same era would not have touched. The Parents Television Council put it on their worst primetime shows list multiple times. The Federal Communications Commission received complaints. The show was watched by parents who thought they were putting their kids to bed early and then crept downstairs to catch the next episode. But the provocation in those early seasons was almost always in the service of a genuine joke. The shocking element was the setup, or the subversion, not the punchline. The thing that made you uncomfortable was not the thing that made you laugh. You laughed because the writing had found something true in an unexpected place, because the joke had a precision to it, because someone had thought carefully about the exact words and the exact sequence and the exact rhythm that would make the thing land properly. You were slightly shocked and then you were laughing, and the two responses were sequential rather than simultaneous. This distinction is the difference between dark humor and shock value. Dark humor uses discomfort as a delivery system for something genuine. Shock value uses discomfort as the payload itself. The early show understood this distinction. The later show lost it. The shift began gradually in the revival seasons and accelerated through seasons 8 and beyond. The violence became more graphic, more detailed, more clearly designed to disturb rather than to surprise. Where early Family Guy might have had a character fall down the stairs in an exaggerated and clearly cartoonish way, the later show would have the same character's injuries described in clinical detail, the kind of specificity that transforms cartoon slapstick into something that belongs to a different register entirely. The specificity was not in service of a better joke. It was in service of a stronger reaction, and the strongest reaction available after you have used up surprise is disgust. The gross-out humor followed the same trajectory. In early Family Guy, gross-out moments were quick and precise. They arrived, did their work, and departed before overstaying. In the later seasons, gross-out scenes became extended and elaborate. Entire sequences would be built around the kind of physical repulsiveness that is not, in itself, comedy, but that generates a visceral response strong enough to be mistaken for comedy by an audience that has been trained to react. There is a difference between laughing and recoiling, and the later seasons frequently produced the latter while apparently believing they were producing the former. The political humor also calcified in ways that changed its effect. In the early seasons, political jokes were usually about human behavior rather than about specific political figures or events, which gave them a shelf life that more topical jokes do not have. The observation that power corrupts, told with enough wit and specificity of detail, is still funny 50 years after it was written. The joke about a specific politician's specific scandal from 2016 stops being funny around 2018 when the scandal has faded from immediate memory and no longer carries the charge it had when it was fresh. Family Guy's political comedy in its later seasons became increasingly topical, increasingly tied to the specific cultural moment of its production, and therefore increasingly dated almost from the moment of its creation. The show was sacrificing longevity for immediacy, trading the kind of comedy that would still work on reruns for the kind that would get a reaction in the week it aired and mean nothing the following month. The fourth wall breaking accelerated as a symptom of the same problem. When characters in Family Guy began regularly acknowledging that they were in a television show, addressing the audience directly, making jokes about the show's own quality or longevity or relationship with the network, it was partly a form of self-awareness and partly a confession. A show that is working does not need to comment on whether it is working. The meta-humor was a way of managing the audience's expectations downward, of getting ahead of the criticism by acknowledging it first. It was the comedy equivalent of telling a joke badly and then saying, I know, the timing was off before anyone could point it out. The acknowledgement does not fix the bad timing. It just makes you seem aware of it. There were individual jokes and scenes scattered through even the worst of the later seasons that demonstrated the show's wit had not been entirely depleted. Moments where a line was constructed with the old precision, where a visual gag had the exact right timing, where a cutaway earned its place with genuine cleverness. These moments were not evidence that the show was still at its peak. They were evidence that the people making it had the capacity for the old kind of comedy and were occasionally deploying it. What they did not have was the consistent discipline to apply that capacity to every episode, to subordinate the easy reaction to the right joke. The promise of clever, timeless comedy was perhaps the show's most ambitious promise, because clever and timeless is a high bar and it requires constant attention. The early seasons met that bar more often than not. The later seasons met it occasionally and missed it routinely. The audience noticed the difference, and the ratings history is the record of their response. Section 11. The ratings and the quiet goodbye. Nobody announced. The numbers are the most honest thing about television. Critics can disagree, fans can argue. The conversations about quality and legacy and what the show used to be versus what it became can go on indefinitely because they are conversations about subjective experience, and subjective experience is not reducible to a single agreed-upon account. But the ratings are not subjective. They are a count. They are the answer to the question of how many people, at any given moment, were choosing to spend their time watching this particular show. The story those numbers tell about Family Guy is one of the most dramatic stories in the history of television comedy. It begins with 22 million viewers for the premiere in January of 1999, a number boosted by the Super Bowl lead-in but still remarkable for a new animated show from an unknown creator. The first season settled into an average of around 12.8 million households, which ranked the show at 33rd in the overall Nielsen ratings for that year. For a debut season, for an animated comedy on Fox, for a show that no one had seen before and that had nothing to trade on, except its own quality and the novelty of its format, those were exceptional numbers. Then the scheduling disruptions. Thursday nights against Frasier, Tuesday nights against Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. The audience, unable to find the show consistently, began to drift. The ratings dropped through seasons 2 and 3, not because people had stopped liking the show, but because Fox had made it too difficult to watch reliably. By the time Fox canceled the show after season 3 in 2002, the audience had scattered across the network's scheduling chaos. The revival in 2005 brought the show back to 7.9 million viewers for season 4, which then rose to nearly 12 million for the premiere episode. The excitement of the return was real and quantifiable. People had missed the show and they showed up to welcome it back. That was the peak of the post-revival ratings, and the story from that point forward is a single, long downward slope. Season by season, the average viewership declined. The decline was gradual enough in the early years that it was possible to attribute it to external factors, to the fragmentation of the television audience, to the rise of streaming services, to the general migration of younger viewers away from scheduled broadcast television toward on-demand consumption. These were real factors. They affected every show on broadcast television during this period, and Family Guy's decline cannot be entirely separated from the broader changes happening in how people watch television. But the decline was also steeper and more sustained than the general trend would account for. Shows that maintained their quality during this period lost viewers more slowly and retained higher percentages of their peak audience. The Simpsons, which was itself in a period of variable quality, still managed a considerably higher floor than Family Guy in the same years. Bob's Burgers, which launched in 2011 and never achieved the culture-wide penetration of Family Guy's peak years, maintained its audience with a consistency that Family Guy could not match. By season 13, which aired from 2014 to 2015, Family Guy was averaging 5.86 million viewers, a meaningful drop from the 7.9 million of season 4, even before accounting for the fact that the television audience overall had grown since 2005. Season 20 brought the number to just 1.31 million viewers, with a 0.45 rating in the key adult 18 to 49 demographic. Season 23, which aired from late 2024 through early 2025, averaged around 723,000 viewers with a 0.19 rating in that same demographic. Less than 750,000 people watching new episodes of a show that had once drawn 12 million. A loss of more than 90% of the peak audience, measured not from the Super Bowl premiere but from the height of the revival. The show that had been one of Fox's most important properties. The show that had demonstrated that an audience's loyalty could literally resurrect a canceled program, was now being watched by fewer people than live in many mid-size American cities. Fox's scheduling decisions reflected this reality. For most of its post-revival run, Family Guy had aired on Sunday nights as part of the Animation Domination block, the prime-time animated lineup that Fox had built around The Simpsons as its anchor. Sunday nights at 9 in the evening, or 9:30, was prestige real estate on Fox, the slot that signaled the network's confidence in a show and its belief that the show could hold an audience. In 2019, Family Guy was moved from the 9 o'clock slot to 9:30, a small demotion that nonetheless signaled something about how the network was reassessing the show's value. Then, more significantly, for the 2023 to 2024 season, Family Guy was removed from the Sunday night block entirely. Its place in the animation domination lineup was given to other shows. Family Guy was scheduled for Wednesday nights. Wednesday nights. The last time Family Guy had aired on a weekday was 2002, during the troubled original run, during the scheduling disruptions that had contributed to its original cancellation. The move from Sunday nights to Wednesday nights was a clear, institutional signal from the network. This show is no longer a headliner. It can no longer reliably draw the audience that makes Sunday night real estate worth defending. The irony of this situation is fully visible only when you hold it against the show's critical high point. In 2009, Family Guy became the first animated series to receive an Emmy nomination for Outstanding Comedy Series since The Flintstones in 1961, nearly 50 years earlier. Not The Simpsons, which by most critical assessments is the greatest animated comedy in television history, had received that nomination. Family Guy had received it. In 2013, TV Guide ranked Family Guy as the 9th greatest television cartoon of all time. These were achievements that belonged to a show that the television industry and the critical establishment had taken seriously as a genuine artistic and cultural force. The show that was being moved to Wednesday nights in 2023 was not that show. The show that was averaging 723,000 viewers in season 23 was not that show. What had persisted was the brand, the characters' faces and voices, and the familiar opening theme. What had not persisted was the quality that had earned the Emmy nomination and the TV Guide ranking. The show continues to be renewed because the economics still make sense. Animated shows are cheap to produce compared to live action. Family Guy generates revenue from streaming rights, from cable reruns, from merchandise, from the library of more than 400 episodes that represents a significant asset regardless of how many people watch new episodes on any given Wednesday night. The renewal announced in April 2025, extending the show through season 27 and the 2028 to 2029 television season, part of a mega deal that also renewed The Simpsons, Bob's Burgers, and returned American Dad to Fox, was a business decision that makes perfect sense from inside a spreadsheet. The show's existence is justified by its revenue, not by its quality, and those two justifications pointed in different directions a long time ago. A spin-off, a show focused on Stewie, was greenlit by Fox and Hulu in early 2026, with a 2-season order planned for 2027 and 2028. This speaks to the enduring value of the Family Guy brand, even as the original show's audience has contracted. The characters remain recognizable and beloved in ways that outlasted the quality of the stories told about them. People who have not watched a new episode of Family Guy in years will still recognize Stewie. They will still hear the theme song and feel something. That recognition is built on the first 3 seasons and the early revival years, on the version of the show that kept its promises. The brand is trading on credit extended by a version of itself that no longer exists. Section 12. American Dad and What Family Guy Could Have Remained. The most damning comparison in Family Guy's story is the one that exists within Seth MacFarlane's own portfolio. American Dad premiered on the 6th of February 2005, just a few months before Family Guy's 4th season revival. It was created by MacFarlane along with Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman, 2 writers who had been part of Family Guy's original team. The show followed the Smith family, Stan Smith, a conservative CIA agent, his wife Francine, their daughter Haley, who was politically liberal and regularly at odds with her father, their son Steve, who was awkward and socially uncertain in the specific way of teenage boys who have not yet figured out who they are, Roger, an alien who had been living in the family's attic since Stan brought him home from a government facility, and Klaus, a German-speaking goldfish whose brain had been transplanted into a fish's body by the CIA. The initial reception to American Dad was cautious. Critics noted its similarities to Family Guy, the animated family, the incompetent but ultimately loving patriarch, the mixture of domestic comedy with absurdist premises. Early reviews called it Family Guy Light, a lesser copy of the more established show. The first season had some rough edges. The political humor was heavy, and the characters were not yet fully developed. It was, genuinely, a show finding its footing. And then, over the next several seasons, something happened that nobody had predicted. American Dad got significantly better while Family Guy got significantly worse. And the trajectory of those two changes crossed somewhere in the middle seasons of both shows in a way that turned the late-stage comparison entirely in American Dad's favor. The single most important structural difference between the two shows is that American Dad does not use cutaway gags. This was a deliberate choice, and it changed everything about how the show had to be made. Without the cutaway as a crutch, the American Dad writing staff was forced to make every episode work as a complete story. Every joke had to emerge from the characters and the situation. Every funny moment had to be earned through plot. You could not insert a disconnected gag to fill a moment that the writing had not developed sufficiently. You had to develop the moment. This forced discipline produced, over time, a better class of storytelling. The plots of American Dad episodes, even the more ridiculous ones, have an internal logic and a developmental coherence that Family Guy's post-revival episodes frequently lack. When something happens in an American Dad episode, there is a reason it happens, connected to something that happened earlier in the episode and producing effects that will be felt in what comes afterward. The episodes feel complete. They feel like things that were designed rather than assembled. Stan Smith, the show's lead character, is a useful counter-study to what happened to Peter Griffin. Stan started as a one-note caricature of conservative, patriotic excess, a collection of political positions and a gun, someone who existed to be wrong in broad and comedic ways. But over several seasons, the writers built out from that caricature into a character of genuine complexity. Stan was often wrong, but he was wrong in specific and human ways that grew recognizably from his background and his values, even when those values were producing bad outcomes. He had episodes where he was clearly the hero, episodes where he was clearly the villain, and episodes where he was recognizably himself in both modes simultaneously. Most importantly, Stan was allowed to change and retain the changes. When something happened to Stan that should have taught him something, the show allowed the lesson to stick, at least partially. He was not fully reset at the start of every episode. His relationships with Francine and Haley and Steve evolved over the course of the show in ways that created genuine arcs rather than just the illusion of arcs. When Stan and Haley had a moment of reconciliation after a long period of conflict, that reconciliation had weight because it was remembered in subsequent episodes rather than erased. Roger the Alien became one of the most inventive ongoing character concepts in animated television. His ability to adopt completely different personas, different names, different backstories, different physical appearances, different entire identities, gave the writers an inexhaustible source of material. Each episode could introduce a new Roger persona, each one more specific and more absurdly detailed than the last. He was a 1970s car dealership owner. He was a film noir detective. He was a retired competitive ice dancer named Ricky Spanish, who appeared in one of the show's most celebrated ongoing bits. He was a dozen characters in a single season, and the humor of each persona came not from the fact of the persona but from its specific details, from the writing's precision about exactly what kind of character this particular Roger persona was. This is the model that Stewie's original concept could have followed. The evil genius baby was not a single joke any more than Roger's ability to adopt personas is a single joke. It was a concept, and concepts have infinite applications. But Family Guy walked away from its most original concept rather than developing it, while American Dad built its equivalent concept into one of the show's most consistent sources of joy. Francine Smith held her ground as a character in ways that Lois Griffin did not. She was warm without being saintly, capable without being perfect, funny in her own right rather than as a straight man for Stan's excess. The relationship between Stan and Francine was difficult, shaped by the specific strains that Stan's personality and profession put on a marriage, but it was also clearly loving in a way that felt authentic. They liked each other. This sounds like a small thing, and it is not. When two characters in a marriage obviously like each other, every episode involving that marriage has something to build on, a foundation of genuine feeling that can be tested and confirmed and tested again. Haley and Steve, the children, maintained consistent characterizations without being flattened. Haley's political liberalism was a character trait that complicated her relationship with Stan in interesting ways without becoming a one-note ongoing argument. Steve's awkwardness evolved as he grew older without losing its essential nature. Klaus was the family's punching bag in some episodes, But he was designed for that role from the beginning, and the humor of his situation came from the specificity of his predicament, a man trapped in a fish's body, rather than from simple cruelty. The show moved from Fox to TBS after season 11. This transition could have damaged it badly. Leaving a major network for cable meant losing audience and advertising revenue and cultural prominence. Instead, the move to TBS gave the writers more creative freedom and the show flourished. New seasons were produced with higher energy and more creative ambition, as though the removal from the network's expectations had unlocked something. Family Guy, during the same period, was clinging to Fox despite MacFarlane's publicized frustrations, was being moved from Sunday nights to Wednesday nights, was averaging fewer than 1 million viewers per episode. The contrast between the two shows, one that had moved gracefully to a new home and maintained its quality, and one that had stayed in its original home and watched its audience erode, was about as clear as these things get. The American Dad comparison is the final answer to the argument that Family Guy's decline was simply the inevitable result of longevity. Both shows have been running for roughly the same length of time, launched in the same year, made by the same creator, airing on the same night for most of their runs. American Dad has not experienced the same catastrophic quality decline that Family Guy has. Its later seasons are not celebrated as its best work, but neither are they widely considered a betrayal of the show's original promise. The writing is consistent, the characters are recognizable, the show still feels like the show it set out to be. American Dad is the proof that the problem with Family Guy was choices, not time, not the inevitable erosion of any long-running comedy. Choices, made by specific people at specific moments, that took the show in directions away from what had made it worth watching. The choice to let Peter become cruel rather than incompetent, the choice to use Brian as a political mouthpiece rather than as a character. The choice to retire Stewie's original concept rather than developing it. The choice to make Meg a target rather than a person. The choice to let the cutaways replace the stories rather than decorate them. The choice to keep the show in production for business reasons after the creative reasons had diminished. None of those choices were inevitable. American Dad made different ones. The evidence that different choices were possible is sitting in the same television history as the evidence of what happened to Family Guy, made by the same creator with many of the same writers. Conclusion: the record of what was. There is something peaceful about laying all of this out finally, about giving it shape and sequence and proportion. Family Guy made specific promises in 1999 and kept them for a specific amount of time and then stopped keeping them, one by one, in ways that were sometimes loud and sometimes so quiet, you had to look carefully to notice them at all. The promise of a father who meant well. The promise of a dog who was worth knowing. The promise of a villain baby who was unlike anything else on television. The promise of an ordinary girl who deserved to be seen. The promise of comedy that rewarded attention. The promise of a family that loved each other underneath all the chaos. The promise of a creator who cared whether the thing he built remained good. These were real promises. They were earned by real work in those first 3 seasons and sustained, imperfectly but genuinely, through parts of the revival years. The evidence that they were real is the grief people still feel about what the show became, the specific kind of disappointment that can only come from something that first gave you something genuine to care about. The show did not fail because it ran too long. The Simpsons has run longer. American Dad has run nearly as long and remains a considerably better show. Shows can survive their own longevity if the people making them remain committed to the specific qualities that made them worth watching. Family Guy survived its longevity as a brand and as a revenue source. It did not survive as the thing it had promised to be. And still, quietly, the early seasons exist. Seasons 1 through 3 are still there, still as good as they were, still carrying the warmth and the cleverness and the genuine humanity of the show at its best. Peter and Lois still love each other in those episodes, in the specific way they always did, imperfect and real. Brian is still worth knowing. Stewie is still dangerous. Meg is still trying. The Griffin family is still a family, still choosing each other, still stumbling through a world that does not always accommodate their particular combination of incompetence and sincerity. Those seasons are the promise kept. Everything after them is the story of what happened when the keeping stopped. The lights are lower now. Your breathing has slowed. Outside, wherever you are, the night is doing what nights do, settling into its own quiet, offering the particular piece of time that is not obligated to be anything in particular. Sleep is close. There is something almost comforting about knowing the full shape of a disappointment, about having traced its edges all the way around and understood where it began and how it grew and where it ended up. The disappointment is still real, but it is also complete, cataloged, set in its proper order. It does not need to surprise you anymore. The Griffins are still in their house in Rhode Island. The theme song still plays on Sunday nights and now on Wednesday nights too. The show still exists, still producing episodes, still sending new versions of these familiar characters into the world. And somewhere, on a streaming service, or a dusty DVD, or a late-night cable rerun block, the early seasons are still exactly as they were. The promise is still there, perfectly preserved in those episodes, waiting for anyone who wants to find out what it sounded like before it stopped being kept. Good night, sleep well, and if something you love has disappointed you, know that the love was real. The disappointment is only possible because of the love, and the love is worth having even when the thing it was attached to changed. If this helped you drift off or gave you something to think about on the way there, a subscription means a lot, and a like takes about 1 second. Drop a comment with where you are watching from and what time it is where you are. Knowing that someone in a different part of the world is falling asleep to the same words is its own kind of beautiful. Until next time, extended section, the writing room, and the mechanics of decline. One thing that never gets enough attention in conversations about how Family Guy changed is the specific mechanics of how a television writing room works, because those mechanics are directly responsible for the specific shape the decline took. A television writing room is not a democracy, but it is also not a dictatorship. It is closer to a specific kind of collaborative conversation that happens over months, where individual writers pitch ideas and other writers build on those ideas. And the showrunner or creator shapes the conversation and decides which directions to pursue. The quality of that conversation determines almost everything about the quality of the show, and the quality of the conversation is determined by 2 things: who is in the room and what they are trying to achieve. In Family Guy's original run, the room was shaped by MacFarlane's very clear sense of what the show was. The writers who were there in those first 3 seasons, Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Ricky Blitt, Neil Goldman and Garrett Donovan, Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman, had been selected specifically for their fit with the show's sensibility and their alignment with MacFarlane's vision. They were not all the same kind of writer. They had different strengths and different instincts, but they were working toward the same thing, which was a show that balanced warmth and irreverence, that used absurdism in service of genuine character rather than as a replacement for it, that trusted the audience to do a certain amount of work and rewarded them for doing it. When the show was canceled and then revived, that specific room did not reassemble. The writers had dispersed to other projects, other shows, other careers. The room that reconvened for season 4 included some familiar names but was substantially different in its composition. New writers brought different instincts, different senses of what was funny and where the limits of the show's register lay. They were not worse writers than the originals, necessarily. They were different ones, and their differences moved the show in directions away from what it had been. One of the most important changes was in how the room thought about Peter. Early Peter had been written with a specific care that kept his idiocy grounded, that made sure his worst moments were always contextualized within his broader love for his family. The new writers were working with a character whose template they had absorbed as viewers rather than as makers, and the template they had absorbed was the broad strokes: big, dumb, funny. The specific calibrations that kept those broad strokes from becoming mean were not part of what they had absorbed, because they were not visible in the finished episodes. They lived in the room, in the conversations about how far was too far and why specific choices were made. When the people who had those conversations were no longer in the room, the calibrations were lost. This is not a dramatic moment. There is no scene in any documentary about Family Guy where someone decides to make Peter meaner. It happened in the accumulation of individual choices, each one small, each one defensible in isolation, each one a little further from the original calibration. By the time the aggregate effect was visible, the direction had been established firmly enough that reversing it would have required a deliberate, acknowledged effort, and no one in a position to make that effort was paying close enough attention. The same process happened with Brian. The early Brian had been written with a specific understanding of the difference between being smart and being insufferable, and understanding that a genuinely intelligent character could be right about things without being obnoxious about being right. This is a difficult balance to maintain across many seasons and many writers, because the easiest version of a smart character is the smug one, the character who knows they are right and communicates their rightness with an edge of contempt for those who have not yet reached the same conclusions. Early Brian skated close to that line but did not cross it because someone was watching the line. When no one was watching it anymore, he crossed it. The Stewie change was the one with the clearest creative rationale and the clearest long-term consequences. MacFarlane and the writers made a conscious decision to move Stewie away from his original concept because they believed it was running out of material. What they may not have fully understood at the time was that the belief itself was the problem. A concept runs out of material when the writers run out of ideas for it, and the writers ran out of ideas for Evil Stewie, while still being at an early stage of what was possible with that concept. The genre of the character, the evil genius with a specific set of targets, had barely been scratched. The decision to retire it was a decision made from creative exhaustion rather than from the logic of the character's own development. The Meg situation had a different and more troubling origin. The escalation of cruelty toward Meg does not seem to have been a deliberate creative decision so much as a pattern that developed because it got a reaction from the audience and was never checked. Shock value humor about Meg's appearance and unwantedness discovered early that audiences would respond, and the show kept going to that source the way someone goes to any source that has previously delivered a result. Each escalation required a greater degree of cruelty to produce the same reaction, which is the defining characteristic of the shock value cycle. The writers may not have sat down and decided to be cruel to Meg. They may have simply kept making the existing joke a little louder, a little sharper, a little more extreme, without noticing that the cumulative effect of many such escalations was something genuinely disturbing. What would have stopped the pattern was the same thing that would have maintained the calibrations for Peter and Brian and Stewie. Someone in the room with the authority and the attention to notice when the show was drifting from its own values and to redirect it. That person had been MacFarlane in the original run. His absence from the active creative process meant that the drifts that would have been caught became the new baseline. Extended section, the specific episodes that defined each era. You can understand Family Guy's trajectory through the lens of specific episodes, moments that crystallized what the show was at each stage of its history. Season 1, Episode 3, Chitty Chitty Death Bang. This is the episode where Stewie's villainous persona is on full display, in a way that perfectly encapsulates what made early Stewie work. He attempts to escape from the hospital, having mistaken his obstetrician for one of his many enemies. He is foiled repeatedly by the mundane realities of being an infant. The comedy comes entirely from the gap between his self-perception as a dangerous and capable villain and his actual situation as a creature who cannot yet hold a fork. It is economical, precise, and genuinely funny without resorting to anything extreme. It works entirely through character. Season 2, Episode 13, Road to Rhode Island. The first of the Road 2 episodes, in which Brian and Stewie travel across the country trying to get home after being stranded in Texas. This episode established the Brian and Stewie dynamic in its most positive form, before that dynamic became a replacement for Stewie's original character rather than an addition to it. The two characters complement each other beautifully in this episode. Stewie's precision and Brian's sardonic warmth play against each other in ways that feel genuinely surprising. There is a late scene in the episode involving Brian discovering something about his mother's fate that is unexpectedly affecting. The show earns the emotion without overdoing it. Season 3, Episode 16, Peter Griffin. Husband, father? Brother? This is the episode where Peter discovers he has African-American heritage, a premise that the show treats with more seriousness than its initial setup suggests. It is not a perfect episode, but it demonstrates something about early Family Guy's ambition, the willingness to take a premise somewhere genuinely uncomfortable and see what might be found there, rather than just using the premise for easy jokes. Peter's attempts to reconcile a new piece of self-knowledge with his existing identity, however clumsily handled, had something real in it. Season 5, Episode 1, Stewie Loves Lois. This is one of the best episodes in the post-revival period, notable for showing the Stewie-Lois relationship from an angle that the evil baby premise had never fully explored. Stewie, who has been trying to kill Lois for years, develops a brief and disorienting affection for her when she attends to a medical problem he has been too embarrassed to report. The episode uses this inversion cleverly, exploring what it would mean for the show's central ongoing dynamic to be reversed, and it does so with enough genuine feeling that it becomes something more than just a premise episode. Season 8, Episode 17, Brian and Stewie. This is the episode that most clearly demonstrates what Family Guy could have been if it had maintained its early quality across more of its run. Brian and Stewie are locked in a bank vault. They talk to each other honestly for 22 minutes. Brian reveals his struggles with depression and the gun he keeps for his darkest moments. Stewie reveals the depth of his love for Brian. The episode contains no cutaways, no external subplot, nothing except two characters and the truth they are willing to tell each other. It is one of the finest episodes in the show's entire history, and it is evidence that the capacity for this kind of storytelling was present in the later seasons, available when someone chose to use it. Season 10, Episode 2, Seahorse Seashell Party. This is the episode that most clearly demonstrates what Family Guy was choosing not to be. Meg's confrontation of her family has genuine power. The speech is well written and well performed. For a few minutes, it feels like the show is about to do something brave, to acknowledge what it has been doing and commit to changing it, and then it does not. The retreat from the episode's own best moment is its defining characteristic, the moment that tells you everything about the show's relationship to its own potential. Season 12, Episode 6, Life of Brian. Brian is killed by a car. The family grieves. The grief is written with genuine care, which makes what comes next more complicated. 3 weeks later, Brian is restored through time travel, and the emotional investment the show asked for is revealed to have been in service of a ratings calculation rather than a story that needed to happen. It is not that the episode is badly made. It is that the episode's existence as a stunt retroactively drains the genuine emotion from the grief it created. These episodes trace a curve. In the early seasons, the best episodes were the norm. In the middle seasons, the best episodes were the exceptions, proof that the capacity remained even when the consistent deployment of that capacity had faded. In the later seasons, episodes like Brian and Stewie showed up rarely enough that they functioned as nostalgic interruptions of a different kind of show, beautiful detours through a landscape the show usually did not bother visiting anymore. Extended section. The promise to its audience that television makes. There is a broader promise that every long-running television show makes to its audience, a promise that goes beyond the specific characters and their specific arcs. It is the promise that the investment of time and attention and feeling that an audience makes in a show will be honored, that the show will not treat that investment as irrelevant. This promise is harder to define than the promises individual characters make, but it is real and its breach is felt more deeply than any individual character's decline. When you watch a show for years, you are doing something specific and important. You are extending a form of trust. You are agreeing to carry these characters with you, to bring them into the fabric of your memory and your experience, to let them mean something to you. That is not a trivial commitment. People have favorite episodes of television shows the way they have favorite books, the way they have favorite pieces of music. The shows that become part of people's lives in that way have received something real. Family Guy in its early years was receiving that kind of real investment from its audience. The evidence is in the Adult Swim ratings, in the DVD sales, in the fan communities that grew up around the show, in the petitions that were circulated when it was canceled, in the celebrations when it came back. People were giving the show something genuine, and in its early years, the show honored that gift by continuing to be genuinely good, by continuing to develop the characters and the world in ways that rewarded continued attention. The breach of the broader promise happened not in any single episode, but in the accumulation of reset buttons and abandoned consequences and characters drifting away from their own values without acknowledgement. Each reset told the audience, the investment you made in the previous episode does not carry forward. Each abandoned consequence told them, the things that happen here do not matter enough to be remembered. Each character drift told them, the person you were rooting for no longer exists, but we are going to keep using their name and appearance and pretend nothing has changed. This is a specific kind of disrespect, not hostile exactly, but careless in a way that disrespects through inattention rather than through deliberate contempt. It is the disrespect of something that no longer takes you seriously as an audience that has concluded your attention will continue regardless of whether it is being earned. And audiences eventually respond to that conclusion the way people respond to any relationship where they have been taken for granted. They leave. Not with drama, not with a declaration. They just quietly stop showing up, and one day the absence is noticed, and by then it is too late to do much about it. The 723,000 viewers of Season 23 are the record of that departure. They are not a verdict on the show's worth in any final sense. They are just the number of people who, after everything, are still showing up. Some of them are there out of habit. Some of them genuinely still love what the show is doing. Some of them are watching while doing something else, with the show as background sound rather than as the object of real attention. They are the remnant of an audience that was once 12 million strong, scattered across the years in which the show stopped honoring the investment they had made. Extended section. What could have been the road not taken? It is useful, as a final accounting, to think about what Family Guy might have been if the specific choices that led to its decline had been made differently. If Peter had been kept calibrated at his early level, allowed to grow slightly smarter and somewhat more emotionally available as his children got older, as parents sometimes do when the reality of their children's needs presses up against their own limitations. He could have remained lovable through his incompetence while developing enough self-awareness to make the recurring patterns of his behavior genuinely funny rather than just grimly predictable. There are shows built on the lovable incompetent that have sustained that premise across many seasons by allowing the character to be wrong in new ways rather than in the same ways with increasing intensity. That evolution was available to Family Guy with Peter, and the show chose not to take it. If Brian had been allowed to grow into his pretensions rather than being consumed by them, if the failed novel had eventually been written and had been genuinely bad in specific and well-observed ways rather than just generically bad, if Brian's unlucky romantic life had been treated with the pathos of a genuinely romantic character rather than the embarrassment of a fraud, he could have remained someone worth caring about. The character's later seasons demonstrate that the writers knew what Brian's flaws were. Quagmire's speech in Jerome is the new black is accurate precisely because the writers anchors Brian's specific failings. The failure was not in the diagnosis but in the refusal to apply it. If Stewie's original concept had been developed rather than retired, if the evil genius baby had found new enemies beyond just Lois, new schemes beyond world domination, new situations that put his particular combination of immense capability and physical limitation to use in different ways. If the weapons had continued to evolve, if the schemes had continued to grow more ambitious, if the dramatic irony of everyone around him being unable to perceive what he was had been used as the basis for new and stranger comic scenarios as the world he inhabited changed around him. There was enough material in that original concept for another 15 seasons, minimum. The writers thought otherwise, and acted on that belief. If Meg had been allowed to develop, to push back, to grow in ways that the early seasons suggested were possible, if the show had been willing to let the ordinary teenager become an extraordinary adult, to let the girl who had been overlooked in her own family find a place in the world that rewarded the specific qualities that had made her hard to see at home. Mila Kunis's voice acting throughout the show's run has always been a cut above what the writing gave her to work with, always suggesting a character of greater depth than the scripts were requiring her to play. The gap between what Kunis was capable of and what the writing asked of her became increasingly visible as the years went on, and it was always a loss. If the cutaway gags had remained a seasoning rather than becoming the meal, if the episodes had maintained their structural integrity, had continued to be stories rather than delivery mechanisms for disconnected moments, if the comedy had continued to be earned through precision rather than through escalation, the show had proven in its first 3 seasons that it could operate at a very high level of comedic craft. That craft was not used up. It was redirected toward goals that did not require it. None of these roads were taken. They were available and they were not taken. And American Dad, running alongside Family Guy for all these years, demonstrates that different roads can lead to different places, that the same person who built Family Guy also built a show that took different roads and arrived somewhere considerably better. The promises Family Guy made were worth making. They were kept long enough to matter. The breaking of them was not inevitable. That is perhaps the most important thing to say at the end of all this. The disappointment is real, and it is earned, and it is legitimate. But disappointment requires something real to have existed first. The love you once felt for the show, the way those early seasons lived in your mind, the characters who felt like people you actually knew, all of that was real. The show gave you something genuine before it stopped. And the something genuine it gave you does not become less true because of what came after. It is enough to know that the best of it happened. The rest is just the record. Extended section. The specific language of disappointment. There is a vocabulary that fans of long-running shows develop for talking about what happens when those shows change, and it is worth spending some time with that vocabulary because the words people use to describe these changes reveal something about the specific quality of the experience of watching a show you loved become something else. Flanderization is the most common term, borrowed from the Simpsons fandom and applied broadly to animated comedies that reduce their characters to single defining traits. The term comes from Ned Flanders, who began the show as a fully rounded neighbor with genuine warmth and complexity and became, over many seasons, a character who existed primarily as a demonstration of religious excess. His other qualities, his competence as a father, his genuine friendship with Homer, his capacity for grief and joy, and the full range of human experience, were crowded out by the religious trait until it consumed everything. Family Guy's use of Flanderization was more total and more systematic than almost any other show that the term gets applied to. It did not affect one or two characters. It affected essentially every major character in the main cast, each one reduced to a single dominant trait that expanded to crowd out everything else. Peter became his stupidity and his cruelty. Brian became his pretentiousness and his hypocrisy. Stewie became his emotional vulnerability and his sexuality. Meg became her victimhood. Lois, who had been one of the more fully realized characters in the early seasons, became a kind of cipher, present and then absent, sympathetic and then cold, with the inconsistency of a character who has lost her through line. The word that fans use alongside Flanderization is seasonal rot, a term for the specific quality of decline that sets in when a show has been running long enough that the writers have exhausted their fresh ideas and are beginning to repeat themselves, to produce episodes that feel like echoes of better episodes from earlier seasons. Seasonal rot is distinguishable from ordinary decline because it has a specific texture, a sense of going through familiar motions, of watching a show that knows its own moves too well and is no longer surprised by anything it produces. The jokes land in the places where jokes are expected to land. The emotional beats hit at the moments when emotional beats are designed to hit. Everything is competent and nothing is surprising. Family Guy entered seasonal rot somewhere around season 8 or 9, depending on who you ask, and the quality of the rot was exacerbated by the show's own characteristics. A show that has built a reputation for being willing to go anywhere, to be surprising, to subvert expectations, feels its seasonal rot more acutely than a show that was always more predictable. When the surprises stop coming from a show that had promised surprises, the absence is felt more sharply. The term character assassination gets used in discussion of Brian and, to a lesser extent, Peter, to describe what happened when the writers took characters whose fundamental qualities had been established and then systematically dismantled those qualities in favor of something darker. Character assassination in television is different from character growth because it has no narrative justification. When a character changes through genuine dramatic events, the change follows from the events and can be traced back through the story. When a character is assassinated, the change simply occurs episode by episode, without any story logic connecting the new version to the old one. Brian did not become selfish and hypocritical because something happened to him that would produce that change. He became those things because the writers stopped caring about maintaining the version of him that was not those things. These words, Flanderization, seasonal rot, character assassination, are the vocabulary of a specific kind of grief. They are the words people reach for when they are trying to describe the experience of losing something they cared about to something they do not. The precision of the vocabulary is itself revealing, because people only develop precise vocabulary for experiences that occur frequently enough to require it. The fact that these terms exist and are widely used and are immediately understood by large communities of people who grew up watching animated television says something about how common the experience of watching a loved show decline is, and how real the loss feels to those who experience it. Family Guy is one of the most discussed examples of all these phenomena, not because it declined more dramatically than any other show in the history of television, but because the combination of how high it had risen, how specific and genuine the promises it had made, and how systematically it had failed to keep them, produced a decline that felt particularly instructive. It was a case study with clear chapters, each chapter well documented, each turning point visible and identifiable. It was, in a strange way, almost pedagogically useful as a demonstration of everything that can go wrong with a long-running comedy. Extended section: the cultural footprint, what the show left behind. Despite everything, Family Guy left a mark on the culture that is genuine and not small. The show arrived at a specific moment in the history of American comedy, a moment when the dominant comedic mode was the snark of the 1990s, the ironic distance of a generation that had grown up watching too much television and had developed a sophisticated immunity to sincerity. Family Guy participated in that mode while also, in its best moments, quietly subverting it. The show was ironic and self-aware and full of pop culture references, yes, but underneath all of that was a family that genuinely loved each other, and the love was not being played for irony. It was being played straight, underneath all the irreverence, and the combination was something the moment needed. The show's influence on subsequent animated comedy is substantial and often acknowledged. Shows that came after, particularly in the adult animation space, owe debts to Family Guy's willingness to push into uncomfortable territory, its use of the cutaway as a structural device, its mixture of domestic comedy with absurdist premises. You can see Family Guy's DNA in shows that came out in the years after its peak, in the specific relationship between character comedy and random gag comedy that characterizes a certain mode of animated writing. The show also did something important for a specific generation of people who discovered it on Adult Swim in 2003, or on DVD around the same time. For a lot of people in their late teens and early 20s in those years, Family Guy was one of the primary comedy texts of their world. The specific cadences of its humor, the way it moved between sentiment and subversion, the specific timing of its jokes, shaped how a generation thought about what comedy could do. That is not nothing. That kind of influence is not erased by what happened in later seasons. The specific characters left impressions that have lasted. Stewie's voice, the plummy British menace of his early seasons, became one of the most recognized voices in American popular culture, quoted and referenced and imitated by people who had barely seen the show. Peter's specific brand of cheerful buffoonery, even in its later and less lovable forms, gave the language a certain shorthand for a specific type of masculine excess. Brian's failed novelist identity resonated with enough people that the character became a kind of archetype for a specific kind of intellectual pretension, which is a strange legacy for a talking dog but is no less real for being strange. The show also produced some genuinely iconic individual moments that have endured as cultural artifacts. The Conway Twitty gag, whatever it says about the later season's laziness, is also a piece of comedy history in its own right, a moment that was so committed to its own absurdity that it achieved a kind of inverted greatness. The chicken fights, those elaborate, extended, operatically violent confrontations between Peter and the giant chicken, became a beloved recurring bit that audiences consistently reported as one of their favorite things about the show. The Road to episodes, which began with Road to Rhode Island in the second season and continued through the revival years, became a format that the show executed consistently well, producing some of the strongest individual episodes in any given season they appeared in. These things belong to the record too. The legacy of Family Guy is not purely a tragedy. It is a more complicated story, a story about something that was genuinely great and then changed and kept going, that kept producing moments of real quality even as the overall quality declined, that made a cultural contribution that outlasted and in some ways transcended its own decline. The children who watched Family Guy in its original run, or who discovered it in reruns and on DVD, grew up and had careers, and some of them went into comedy and television, and they brought with them whatever they had absorbed from watching the show in those years. The influence of early Family Guy is in the water of American comedy in ways that cannot be traced exactly, but that can be felt. That is a real legacy, even if it is one that the show in its later years did little to honor or extend. Extended section: the sound of Family Guy voice, music, and the texture of memory. There is something about the way a show sounds that can carry more emotional weight than any other element, because sound is the thing that reaches you when your eyes are somewhere else, when you are doing other things, when you are not actively watching but are simply present in the same space as the television. The theme song to Family Guy, the Griffin family singing about how things used to be better on television and how they believe the show will be a hit because it features them all, is one of the most recognizable pieces of music from the American television of the early 2000s. It is a deliberately retro piece of writing, structured like a classic variety show theme, with a certain ironic affection for the forms it is imitating. It established the show's relationship to television history from the very first frame. This show knew what came before it and was having a conversation with that history, not just imitating it. The music throughout the early seasons was handled with care and genuine craft. Family Guy had always been willing to use music in ways that other animated comedies were not, partly because MacFarlane himself was a trained musician with a genuine love of classic American popular music, and partly because the show's comedic sensibility had always had room for the kind of carefully placed emotional beat that a well-chosen musical moment can produce. The episode Brian Wallows and Peter Swallows from the third season, which won the Emmy, is built around a song, and the song is genuinely good, genuinely funny, and genuinely affecting in the way that only good songwriting can be. The voice performances in the show's early years were precise in a way that is easy to miss, because the show's comedy was always the foreground. MacFarlane's voice for Peter is a very specific construction, thick and nasal, and with a particular quality of enthusiasm that is just slightly off the calibration of how enthusiasm sounds in the real world. It is a performance that is doing something specific, that has been thought about and refined, that knows what it is trying to accomplish. The Peter voice communicates incompetence and warmth in the same breath, which is exactly what the character needed. Alex Borstein's Lois had a similar precision. The voice was nasal in a different way from Peter, more knowing, with a dry quality that communicated Lois's awareness of her situation, while also communicating her genuine love for the situation. There is a specific sound that Lois makes when she is exasperated and also charmed at the same time, a quality in Borstein's delivery that captures the specific experience of loving someone who is reliably aggravating. That quality was there from the beginning and was one of the things that made Lois feel real. Seth Green's Chris had always been a character who lived in the margins of episodes, present but not foregrounded, a voice that existed as a specific texture in the Griffin household's soundscape rather than as a leading instrument. Green played Chris with a kind of innocent blankness that was perfect for the role, a voice that suggested genuine guilelessness rather than performed naivety. Mila Kunis's Meg, as noted earlier, was always delivering more than the writing asked her to. The voice Kunis found for Meg, especially in the early seasons, had a quality of earnest trying that was genuinely sympathetic. She sounded like a teenager who was doing her best with the available resources, which is exactly the right sound for that character in those early seasons. These voices, taken together, created the sound of the Griffin household, the specific acoustic texture of a place that felt lived in and real. When you watched Family Guy in those early years, you were not just watching animated characters. You were hearing a family that had its own sonic identity, its own rhythms of conversation and argument and laughter. That acoustic identity was maintained through the later seasons because the voice cast remained stable even as the writing changed. The voices were consistent even when the characters they were delivering were not. This created a strange situation. The familiar sounds of people you knew saying things that those people would not have said in ways that those people would not have said them. The voices held on to the early characters even when the scripts had let them go. It was a form of loyalty to the original that lived in the performance even when it had disappeared from the writing. Extended section: The Promise of Legacy and What Remains. Every show that runs long enough becomes its own archive, an accumulation of choices and accidents and moments of genuine quality and moments of genuine failure, a record of what a group of people were trying to do and what they actually managed and what they forgot along the way. Family Guy's archive is enormous. More than 450 episodes across more than 25 years of production, not counting the specials and the direct-to-DVD film and the spin-offs that came and went. It is one of the largest bodies of work in animated television history, and it contains within it multiple different shows that happen to use the same characters and the same setting and the same theme song. There is the show from 1999 to 2002, precise and warm and genuinely inventive, the show that earned the loyalty that would eventually bring it back from cancellation. This show is finished and perfect in the way that completed things can be perfect, the way that a book is more finished than a document, because it was completed by forces outside its own control and not by the choices of the people making it. The cancellation that ended it preserved it. There is the show from 2005 to 2008, the revival years. Somewhat different from the original, but still recognizably continuous with it, still producing episodes that could stand alongside the first run without embarrassing themselves, still maintaining enough of the warmth and the craft to justify the loyalty it was trading on. There is the show from 2009 onwards, the show that diverged more significantly from the original, that produced the Brian and Stewie episode and the Conway Twitty gag in roughly the same creative environment, that showed flashes of its original quality alongside extended periods of the behavior that made critics and fans increasingly frustrated. This show is more contradictory, more inconsistent, harder to account for cleanly. And there is the current show, the show that has settled into its late middle age, that produces 15 episodes a season for a network that has moved it to Wednesday nights, that still exists and will continue to exist through season 27 and possibly beyond, because the business arrangements sustain it regardless of its creative direction. All of these shows share a name and a set of characters and a physical location. What they do not entirely share is a creative identity. Each subsequent version of Family Guy is related to the ones that came before it, but related in the way that people are related to their own earlier selves, by continuity rather than by exact correspondence. The Peter Griffin of Season 24 is connected to the Peter Griffin of Season 1 through an unbroken line of episodes, but he is not the same character any more than a person at 50 is the same person they were at 25. What remains from the original promise, from the show that Family Guy was at the beginning, is preserved in specific episodes and in the specific memories of people who watched them at the right time in the right conditions. The episode you watched at 2 in the morning on Adult Swim in 2003, the episode you replayed on DVD until you knew every line, the episode that made you feel like the people who made this show really understood something about the world, that episode is unchanged and unchangeable. Whatever happened in subsequent seasons did not retroactively alter those experiences. The thing you loved was real when you loved it. The promise the early show made was kept long enough to mean something. The breaking of that promise is real and documented and worth understanding. But the love that produced the disappointment is also real. And in any honest accounting of what Family Guy was and what it became, the love belongs in the record alongside the disappointment. They both happened. They are both true. The early seasons were genuinely great. The later seasons were genuinely lesser. The promises were made sincerely and kept imperfectly and eventually broken in ways that were consequential. The audience that had been built through genuine quality was sustained by brand loyalty long after the quality was gone. The show continued because it was profitable and stopped being great because it stopped being made by people who had a burning need for it to be great. All of this is the record. All of this is the shape of what happened. And somewhere in that shape, if you look at it from the right angle, you can still see the outline of what it was trying to be. The family underneath the chaos, the warmth underneath the comedy, the genuine thing that was there at the beginning and that the show never entirely stopped reaching for, even in its worst moments. That reaching is also part of the record. Good night. Extended section. The science of why we keep watching things that disappoint us. There is a question underneath everything we have been talking about tonight that is worth sitting with, and it is this. Why did people keep watching Family Guy for so long after it had stopped being what they had loved? The answer is not simple, and it is not just habit, though habit is part of it. It has to do with something specific about how we form attachments to fictional characters and worlds, and what those attachments ask of us once they have been formed. When you spend a significant amount of time with a fictional world, something happens in the way you process it that is different from how you process other kinds of information. The characters become familiar in the way that people you know become familiar, which means you start to have expectations of them that are not entirely conscious. You expect Peter to sound a certain way, to approach a situation with a certain combination of incompetence and enthusiasm, to eventually circle back to the people he loves even after the disaster of whatever he has done. You carry that expectation with you into each new episode without deciding to, the way you carry expectations about how a friend will behave when they call you. When those expectations are violated, the violation registers as something stranger and more personal than ordinary disappointment. It is the specific discomfort of knowing someone well enough to see that they are acting out of character, of watching someone do something that the person you thought you knew would not do. People talk about feeling like a character has been stolen from them, which sounds hyperbolic until you understand the mechanism. The character you formed your attachment to was real, in the sense that they had a consistent identity that was real, and the character currently appearing on the screen under their name does not share that identity in the ways that mattered. The original version was taken and replaced, and the replacement is using the original's name and appearance without authorization. This is why fans use such strong language about the flanderization of characters. They are not being dramatic. They are accurately describing the phenomenology of their experience. They knew Brian. The show replaced Brian with someone who had Brian's voice and Brian's dog body and Brian's history of interactions with the Griffin family, but did not have Brian's character, his specific combination of intelligence and warmth and loyal friendship and human-scale failure. The show expected the audience to continue their attachment to Brian as though the replacement were the original, and the audience's refusal to do so, their insistence on distinguishing between the two, was a form of loyalty to the actual character rather than to his brand. The continued watching, despite the decline, was partly about this same attachment. As long as there was any chance of seeing the original character, any chance that a given episode would deliver a moment of the old quality, the attachment that had been formed in the early seasons kept people watching. The Season 8 episode Brian and Stewie delivered exactly that kind of moment, which is why it is so often cited as one of the best episodes in the show's later run. It reminded people of what they had originally attached to, gave them a clear view of the characters they had loved in the middle of a period when those characters had been obscured, and that reminder was enough to sustain watching for another stretch. The other reason people kept watching was the social dimension of television, which is easy to underestimate. Family Guy at its peak was a show that people talked about at school, at work, at parties. Lines from episodes were quoted. Cutaways were replayed and passed around. Being familiar with the show was part of a certain kind of cultural literacy, and cultural literacy is self-reinforcing, because the more people share a reference, the more valuable knowing that reference becomes. Even as the quality declined, the social currency of Family Guy knowledge remained positive for years after the quality peak, because the audience's size and engagement had created a body of shared references that remained in circulation. By the time the social currency had deflated enough that the continued watching could no longer be sustained by it, the habit of watching had been established long enough that many people were watching out of pure inertia. Not enthusiasm, not expectation of quality, simply the continuation of something that had been started a long time ago and had never been formally ended. The formal endings of television relationships are rare. Most people do not have a moment where they decide, consciously and permanently, that they are no longer a viewer of a particular show. What happens instead is a gradual recession. Episodes missed and not caught up on, then seasons missed and not caught up on, and eventually an awareness that the show is still running but that its running has nothing to do with your life anymore. That recession happened to Family Guy viewers in waves, each wave corresponding roughly to a period of particularly acute quality decline, until the audience that remained was the small remnant that the later ratings reflect. Extended section: Rhode Island, small towns, and the meaning of place. One of the quieter pleasures of early Family Guy that is rarely discussed is the specific sense of place it built in those first 3 seasons. The show was set in a fictionalized version of small city Rhode Island, and while the setting was never the point the way it is in a show like Twin Peaks or The Wire, it was handled with enough specificity to create a genuine sense of somewhere. Rhode Island itself is a specific kind of American place. The smallest state in the Union, dense and coastal, with a particular history that included both old money and industrial poverty, mill towns and Newport mansions, a Catholic working class and a WASP elite that had been there since the colonial period. The town of Quahog, the show's fictional setting, was not a careful sociological portrait of Rhode Island, but it drew on the real place enough to have texture, to feel like a particular corner of a particular world, rather than a generic American suburb. The Griffins neighborhood had the specific quality of neighborhoods in small American cities, streets where the houses are close enough together that you know your neighbors whether you want to or not, where the bar down the street is the community center for a certain stratum of the population, where people stay for decades and develop the accumulated knowledge of proximity. The Drunken Clam, the bar where Peter and Joe and Quagmire and Cleveland spent their evenings, was not a generic television bar. It was a specific kind of local institution, the kind that serves as the social infrastructure for people who cannot afford more expensive or more aspirational forms of sociality. This specificity of place was part of what gave the show its texture in the early years. When the show got bigger and more ambitious in its post-revival run, when the episodes started to take the characters to more exotic locations and more spectacle-friendly situations, some of that texture was lost. The Griffins became less of a small Rhode Island family and more of a generic animated sitcom family who happened to live in Rhode Island, and the difference was felt in the quality of the comedy. The best comedy about specific places does not require the place to be inherently funny. It requires the people who live there to be understood in their relationship to the place, to be shaped by it in ways that the comedy can use. Early Peter's working-class sensibility, his specific relationship to his bar and his friends and his modest house and his modest job, was connected to the place he lived. He was a product of a specific economic and social environment, and his comedy was grounded in that environment. Later, Peter, who became increasingly disconnected from any realistic social context, lost that grounding, along with the warmth and the sympathy that the grounding had provided. Small towns in American fiction serve a particular function. They provide the friction of a world where everyone knows everyone, where reputations are durable and consequences accumulate rather than resetting with each new episode of life. Early Family Guy used that friction productively. The fact that the neighbors knew each other, that Joe and Quagmire and Cleveland were regulars in Peter's life rather than just recurring guest characters, gave the show's stories a weight that the later, more episodic and reset button-dependent approach could not sustain. In a world where relationships matter and persist, what you do has consequences for who you are to the people around you. When the show abandoned consequences, it also abandoned the world where consequences were possible. The specific sound of small city Rhode Island, the specific texture of that working-class neighborhood, the specific flavor of the Drunken Clam as a social institution, were part of the show's early promise even if they were never foregrounded. They were the world the characters inhabited, and the way they inhabited it told you something about who they were. That world became less present as the show went on, replaced by the more flexible but less specific world of a generic animated sitcom, and the loss of specificity was part of the loss of warmth. Final section. The long view and the peace of understanding. When you step far enough back from the full story of Family Guy, when you look at it from a distance that allows the whole shape to be visible, rather than any single detail, what you see is not primarily a tragedy. It is primarily a story about time and change, and the limits of what any human enterprise can sustain. 25 years is a very long time to make anything. The people who created Family Guy in 1999 were not the same people who were making it in 2024. Not literally, because careers end and people move on and new people arrive, and not even in the individuals who remained, because people change across 25 years in ways that change what they are capable of making and what they care about making. The show that ran for that quarter century was made by many different versions of the same general team, and the differences between those versions produced the differences between the seasons. The promises the early show made were made by a specific group of people at a specific moment in their lives and careers, when they had everything to prove and nothing to protect, when the show was new enough that every choice was made with the freshness of first thought rather than the efficiency of established habit. Those conditions cannot be maintained indefinitely. They are inherently temporary. The freshness wears off. The habits become established. The choices that were once made with passionate deliberateness begin to be made with competent automaticity, and the difference between those two modes is the difference between the early seasons and the later ones. This is not an excuse. The decline was real. The promises were genuinely broken. The audience's disappointment was legitimate, and the love that produced it was real. But understanding the mechanism of how it happened does not require condemning the people who made it happen. It requires acknowledging that making something great is hard, that maintaining greatness over many years is even harder, and that the failure to maintain it is the norm rather than the exception, because the conditions that produce greatness are almost always temporary. What Family Guy produced in those first 3 seasons, and in the best of the early revival years, was genuinely great. It changed the language of animated comedy. It gave a generation of viewers characters they loved. It made promises through its warmth and its cleverness and its specific humanity that were worth making, even knowing they could not all be kept forever. The breaking of those promises does not retroactively unmake the quality of what came before. The early seasons are still there. They exist in the way that things that have been completed and preserved exist, unchanged and accessible, ready to be revisited by anyone who wants to remember what the show was when it was at its best. The promise lives in those episodes even if it was not kept beyond them. And if you are watching this tonight because something in you wanted to remember those early seasons, wanted to spend a little time in the specific texture of that world, wanted to feel again what it felt like to watch a show that was keeping its promises, then the watching was worth it. The remembering matters. The love that these things can inspire is one of the genuine goods of human life, even when the things that inspired it changed. Sleep well. Carry the good parts with you, and remember to like and subscribe, because making this took real time and real care, and knowing that it found you where you are, at whatever hour you are watching this, in whatever part of the world you are in, makes all of it worth the doing. Extended section. The rhythm of watching and what late night does to a story. There is something about watching certain kinds of television late at night that changes what you are doing with it. In the daylight hours, with other things demanding attention and the cognitive noise of a full day still running in the background, television is active viewing. You track plot lines. You notice when something is inconsistent with what came before. You evaluate, compare, form opinions in real time. The critical faculty is running alongside the experience, commenting on it, qualifying it. Late at night, when the house is quiet and the day has exhausted itself and the world outside has gone dark and still, something changes in how you receive things. The critical faculty quiets. The walls between yourself and what you are watching become more permeable. Stories are not evaluated so much as absorbed. Characters feel more present, more immediate, more real in the specific way that things feel real in the hours when reality itself becomes softer at the edges. This is why late-night television has always had a different quality from primetime television, and it is why Adult Swim in 2003 was such a perfect home for Family Guy reruns. The people watching at 1 or 2 in the morning were not watching with the same quality of attention they would have brought to a Sunday night primetime broadcast. They were watching in that softer state, more open, more willing to let the show in, more likely to form attachments to the characters and the world that were vivid and lasting. A generation of people absorbed Family Guy in that late-night state, in dorm rooms and apartments and living rooms after everyone else had gone to bed, and what they absorbed went in differently than it would have in a more conventionally alert state of viewing. The show became part of their late-night life, associated with a specific quality of consciousness, a specific combination of tiredness and openness, and the particular aliveness of being awake when the world has gone to sleep. That association is still present in the memory of everyone who watched Family Guy in those years. The show carries the texture of late night with it, the feeling of a specific time and a specific state of being. This is one of the reasons why revisiting those early episodes, in the same kind of late-night conditions, has a quality of return that goes beyond simple nostalgia. You are not just returning to the show, you are returning to the state of being in which you first received it. The show that you are spending time with tonight, in whatever form this script takes as it finds you, is trying to capture something of that quality. The slow, patient telling of a story. The unhurried movement through things that matter. The sense that there is no rush, that the night is long enough for this, that the telling is as valuable as the arriving at wherever the story is going. Family Guy in its best moments understood that same quality of late-night slowness, the way certain jokes work better when you are not fully alert, the way warmth lands differently when your defenses are down. The early episodes were built partly for this mode of watching, built to reward the kind of attention that comes from tiredness and openness rather than from critical alertness. The show that exists now, with its Wednesday night scheduling and its 15-episode seasons and its 723,000 remaining viewers, has lost touch with that quality. It is a show that exists in the schedule rather than in the imagination. a show that occupies a time slot without occupying a space in people's internal life. The early show did both, and doing both was part of what made it matter. The sleep that is coming to you now, if you are watching this at the right hour in the right conditions, is the sleep that has always come after enough good storytelling. The body relaxing, the mind releasing its hold on the things it has been holding. The specific form of rest that follows from having been genuinely absorbed in something. That absorption was the show's greatest gift in its early years. The ability to take you somewhere else, to make you care about people who were not real and situations that could not happen, to give you a few hours in a world that was warmer and funnier than the one outside the window. The show gave that gift generously when it was keeping its promises. The gift itself is real regardless of what came after. Sleep, rest, let the night do what nights are for. The Griffins are in their house in Rhode Island, in the particular freeze of a fictional world that goes on whether you are watching or not. Peter is probably doing something inadvisable. Brian is probably having a drink and reconsidering his choices. Stewie is somewhere between the person he was and the person the writers decided to make him. Meg is probably trying, in the way she always tried, with the specific determination of someone who has not yet been given a compelling reason to stop. They are all still there, frozen in the amber of a show that kept going long past the point where it was keeping its promises. The early versions of them are also still there, preserved in those first 3 seasons, as good as they ever were. Both things are true and both belong to the record. Good night. A note on what promises mean. It is worth saying one more time. Before this is fully done, what a promise actually is when a television show makes one. A television show is not a person. It cannot shake your hand and look you in the eye and say, "Sincerely, I will be this for you. I will keep being this." What it does instead is demonstrate, through the quality and consistency of what it makes, that certain things can be relied upon. The characters will behave like themselves. The world will have internal logic. The warmth you felt in the first episode will be present in the 20th and the 50th and the 100th. The jokes will come from a place of genuine thought rather than from the easiest available reaction. These demonstrations, repeated often enough, become a kind of promise through the simple force of pattern. When the pattern breaks, the promise breaks. Not because anyone intended to break it, not because a decision was made one day to stop being good, but because the conditions that produce the pattern are no longer present, because the people and the specific quality of attention that built the pattern have changed, because the show has grown into something different in ways that are easy to miss one episode at a time and impossible to miss when you look at the whole trajectory. Family Guy made its promises in the specific way that all great shows make promises, through demonstration, through the patient building of something that could be relied upon. It kept those promises for long enough that they became real to millions of people. And when it stopped keeping them, those people felt the breach as something personal, because the promises had been personal. They had been made in your living room, in your dorm room, in whatever space you occupied in the years when the show was good. That is the shape of the whole story. And it is the shape of a lot of stories about things we loved and then watched change. The specific details belong to Family Guy, but the shape belongs to everyone who has ever been loyal to something that was not equally loyal back. There is rest in understanding the shape. There is peace in seeing the thing clearly. There is even, at the edges, a kind of gratitude for the fact that the original promise was real, that the show was genuinely good, that the love it inspired was not misplaced at the time. The night is doing its work. The day is very far away. Whatever the morning requires can wait until the morning. Sleep. The quieter history things? The show got right that nobody talks about enough. In the long accounting of what Family Guy lost and squandered and failed to keep, it is possible to lose sight of the things it got right that are worth crediting properly. The Road to episodes, beginning with Road to Rhode Island in the second season, were a genuinely inventive ongoing format. They did something that animated comedies rarely do well. They placed 2 characters in an open-ended situation and trusted the characters to drive the episode entirely. No external plot machinery. No cutaways to the rest of the family doing something elsewhere. Just Brian and Stewie, together, navigating whatever the writers had decided to put in their path. The best of these, and there are several that qualify, are among the finest achievements in the show's entire run. Road to the Multiverse from Season 8 was the one that critics most often point to. It traveled through alternative universes, each one a formal and comedic experiment in itself, and it did so with enough visual imagination and enough genuine character work that the formal experiment never felt like it was happening at the expense of the relationship at the episode's center. Brian and Stewie at their best are a pair that has genuinely something to say to each other, and the writers of the Road 2 episodes understood this in ways that the ordinary episodes sometimes forgot. The Star Wars parody episodes, beginning with Blue Harvest in the 7th season, demonstrated something else the show did well: its genuine love of the source material it was parodying. Family Guy's pop culture parodies have always worked best when the love is as visible as the mockery, when you can feel that the people writing the parody actually care about what they are taking apart. The Star Wars parodies had that quality, and they were accordingly some of the most affectionately received episodes of the post-revival run. The show also produced some genuinely strong dramatic episodes in its later years that deserve credit separate from any overall assessment of quality decline. And Then There Were Fewer from Season 9 was a feature-length murder mystery parody that worked as both comedy and genre exercise. Thanksgiving from Season 10 took a premise, the family dinner, and found real emotional truth in it without abandoning the show's comedic identity. These episodes proved that the writing staff of the later seasons was not uniformly unambitious or uncrafted. They were capable of genuine quality when the conditions aligned. The voice cast's commitment to the material throughout the show's entire run deserves specific acknowledgement. Alex Borstein, Seth Green, Mila Kunis, Mike Henry, Patrick Warburton as Joe, they all continued to bring genuine skill and investment to their performances, even as the writing gave them less to work with in quality terms. Voice acting is often underestimated as a craft, treated as a lesser form of performance because it lacks the physical dimension of on-camera acting. The Family Guy cast, consistently and over many years, demonstrated that voice performance at a high level requires as much precision and as much genuine emotional intelligence as any other acting form. They deserved better material than they often received, and they gave better performances than the material always required. The show's music remained a point of pride throughout its run. The original songs produced for episodes, from the Emmy-winning work in Season 3 to the musical episodes in later seasons, showed a consistent level of craft and ambition that was independent of the overall narrative quality. Music was one area where the show never stopped trying, where the people involved never seemed to have decided that good enough was sufficient. The musical numbers in Family Guy episodes were almost always genuinely good, sometimes brilliant, and they functioned as a kind of separate quality track running alongside the main show, a place where the care that had departed from the writing was still being exercised. These things belong to the record too, alongside the disappointments and the broken promises. A complete accounting of what Family Guy was has to include them. The story of Family Guy is not a simple tragedy. It is a more complicated story about an extraordinary thing that happened in American comedy, about the conditions that made it possible and the conditions that made it unsustainable, about the people who built it and the people who maintained it, and the audiences who loved it through multiple different versions of itself. In the quiet of tonight, with the day receding and the world outside gone still, that is the story worth sitting with. Not just the disappointment, but the whole shape of it. The rise and the promise and the keeping and the breaking and the legacy that persists in specific episodes and specific memories and the ongoing love that a generation of people still carries for the version of the show that was at its best. The lights have been low for a while now. Your breathing has been slow for longer. The words have been doing their work at whatever pace they have been doing it, which is the right pace for tonight. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, you are welcome here, in this specific corner of late night where stories are told at the speed of rest. Sleep?